Lovely, lovely companions.
Hello, Denzel. Hello.
That is one very happy dog.
Excited dog, just loves a bit of attention. Who wouldn't from Ben? We'll be back with the headlines shortly.
Live from London, this is BBC News. Big Conservative losses in local elections across England, with the party potentially facing its worst night at the polls in 4 decades. Labour win the Blackpool South by-election with a 26% swing of the vote. Keir Starmer hails his party's performance and has this message.
We want that general election, and we're confident going into that general election, because what this by-election shows is that the country wants change.
The Lib Dems have retained all the councils they held, while it's been a strong night for the Green Party. More than half the results, including the mayoral contests in England's major cities, have yet to be declared. We'll bring you all the latest. Hello, I'm Lewis Vaughan-Jones. Welcome to the programme. We'll bring you all the results and, of course, crucially, what it all means. Now, not all of the results are in yet, and we may have to wait until Saturday for the full picture. But so far, it looks like the Conservatives are having a rough time. They've lost around half of the council seats they were defending. That's similar to how they performed back in 1995. 2 years later, they were crushed at that general election. Labour, the Greens, Lib Dems all made gains, and Labour are celebrating a victory in the Blackpool South by-election with a huge swing from the Conservatives. With the story of the night, here's our political correspondent, Damien Grammaticus.
Commonly known as Chris, Labour Party, 10,825.
Blackpool South, a little before 5 a.m, and a decisive Labour victory. They were confident of emerging winners in the by-election, but this was emphatic.
They have said to Rishi Sunak and to the Conservatives, they've had enough. They've had enough for 14 years of the Conservatives being in power. They have lost trust of the British people, and Blackpool has had enough of this failed government.
The Conservatives, who had held the seat, were beaten into second place, but the shock for Tories will be that Reform very nearly pushed them into third.
They didn't get Brexit done properly, they didn't cut immigration, and people are tired and sick and tired of the Tory incompetence and lies. We're done with it. We're done with the Tories. It's time for change. It's time for reform.
And the first council of the night to change control, Hartlepool.
Q&A at Bailey Fleet, Labour and Cooperative Party, 649 votes.
The Conservatives lost 6 councillors here, Labour in charge again. The win is symbolic for them, clawing back lost ground.
Day, Thomas William, Labour Party, 806.
In Rushmore in Hampshire, Labour have taken control directly from the Conservatives. Boundary changes helped here, but it's also been gaining wards from Tories. Mounting losses, an unwelcome sight for the Conservative minister at the count. And in northeast Lincolnshire, more Labour cheer.
Wow.
Conservatives lost control of the council here. Grimsby is exactly the sort of place Labour will hope to win back at the general election.
Sadly, in local elections, they tend to mirror the polls at national level, and clearly it's a statement of the obvious. We're far behind in the polls nationally, and people have followed through at local level.
But there are warning signs for Labour too. In Oldham, Labour lost control of the council. In areas with substantial numbers of Muslim voters, it's shed support, losing wards. And elsewhere, the Greens have been picking up votes, often at Labour's expense.
Voters are really, really sick of this Conservative
government and the way they've run this country into the ground over the last 14 years, but they're not really feeling inspired by what Keir Starmer's Labour Party is offering.
In Stockport, where they processed the votes in a car park, Liberal Democrats won a couple of wards from Labour, modest advances. But the battlegrounds they care about most are yet to start tallying.
We're expecting to see gains, we're expecting to see good progress, but specifically in the areas where we hope to win parliamentary seats.
And I do hereby declare that Carol Ann Shevlin-Ney is duly elected.
So the picture emerging is one of Labour chalking up gains, Conservatives slipping back, and smaller parties winning support from both of them. Damien Grammaticus, BBC News.
Right, let's take a closer look now at some of the results. Our political correspondent, Nick Eardley, is in the newsroom for us. Hi, Nick, take it away.
Hi, Lewis. Yeah, it's interesting to go over the big picture results so far, but then to look in a bit more detail about some of the trends we've seen in different parts of the country. So let's start off with a big picture this morning at 9 o'clock. It looks like this. As you can see, it's been a decent night for Labour, up 52 seats. A really bad night for the Conservatives. It's looking like it could be really, really bad. They're down 122 seats so far. Modest gains for the Lib Dems, some gains for the Greens as well. Interesting, up 39 independents. I'll come back to that and explain a bit more about why that is. This is what it means at 9 o'clock in terms of councils. You can see Labour up 3 there, the Conservatives down 3. This is the thing that will be looked at closely in the party HQs, though, the change in vote share from 2021. As you can see, it's looking really bad for the Conservatives, down 14%. That will worry a lot of Tories who are trying to figure out what it means for a general election. It's looking pretty good for Labour, up 5%. Some questions about whether that could have been a bit more, but the message we're hearing from Labour is they think that 5% increase is in the areas where they need it to be if they are going to win a general election. But let's look a bit more at what some of the specific results might tell us. This is the overnight results. Actually, let me firstly just kind of give you a broad overview of some of the interesting ones. Here are some of the places where Labour have won. Redditch, they've taken from the Conservatives. Rushmore, they've taken it from the Conservatives as well. Have a look at Hartlepool and Thurrock, which were hung councils, no overall control. They're now Labour. If you're a Tory waking up this morning thinking, is there any light at the end of the tunnel? Maybe a wee bit in places like Harlow and Fareham, where in Harlow, Labour might have done well in taking that on a really good night. And Fareham was one that was in the Lib Dem sites on a good night. Oldham's really interesting. Labour have lost control of that. I'll explain why in a minute. Let's start, though, looking into a bit more detail in Redditch. So if you look down the bottom here, have a look. Redditch has been Conservative for years. It's a bellwether seat. It's one of those places where it gives us a good sense of where the country's headed. And it looks really good for Labour based on what we saw yesterday. As you can see, it's gone from Conservative control to Labour pretty comfortably as well. 14 seats needed for a majority. They got 21. So that's quite significant. Here's what happened. Labour up 10, the Conservatives down 11. I also want to show you Hartlepool. Cast your mind back 3 years, probably the lowest point of Keir Starmer's leadership when Labour lost the Hartlepool by-election. You can see that council's been hung for years. It's not now. Labour have won it, again, pretty comfortably. 24 seats there, 19 needed for control. So they'll be pretty happy about that. Here's how the picture's changed. Labour up 6, the Conservatives down 2. The Independents have lost a couple of seats as well. So the picture looks good for Labour, bad for the Conservatives. But it's not a perfect picture for Labour. Let's look at Oldham in Greater Manchester. I think this is really interesting if we're trying to figure out potential Achilles heels for Labour. Because look at what's happened here. In fact, let me go on to the next page to show you. Independents are up 7 and Labour are down 5. That's why they've lost control. And 5 of those independents were standing on a platform about the war in Gaza. They were saying, we think Labour have the wrong policy, we're annoyed at Labour, we're angry at the position they've taken. And that appears to be one of the key reasons that Labour have lost control in Oldham. The party says, well, look, there are some local factors. We've been losing seats there for a while. But if anything's going to worry Keir Starmer this morning, it'll be that.
Fascinating, Nick. while we've got you, can I get you just to talk us through that by-election result, Blackpool South, and what that shows us?
You can, because I've got a screen to show you, Lewis. Have a look at this here, Blackpool South. The Conservatives won it at the last general election. They got nowhere near this time. Chris Webb, the Labour candidate, with a majority of 7,600. Look at the difference there between the Tories and Reform. It's tiny. That will really worry the Conservatives. Firstly, that Reform are doing so well, but secondly, that the Tories only just scraped into second place. Here's how the voting stacks up. Labour on 59%. Here's the change. Look at that. The Conservative vote is down nearly a third. The Labour vote is up significantly. The Reform vote is significant too. Reform, remember, by the way, is the successor to the Brexit Party, and they're planning on challenging the Conservatives all around England. So in places like Blackpool, that will really worry the Tories. But I think the next thing you're going to see is the most striking graphic of the day so far. Have a look at this. That's a big swing. That's a huge swing. 26% from the Conservatives to Labour. That is the third biggest swing from the Tories to Labour since the Second World War. The other two bigger swings have come recently as well. So there is a pattern now, Lewis. Big swings in by-elections, Conservatives to Labour. It is just a by-election. You wouldn't get the exact same result, we don't think, necessarily, at a general election. But if you're a Conservative MP standing at the general election and you're looking at that this morning, you're going to be worried.
Nick, brilliant stuff. Thank you so much for that. And we are going to seamlessly now head to Blackpool. Our correspondent, Helen Catt, is there. Hi, Helen. Just tell us exactly where you are there and why you're there.
And why? So I'm at Blackpool Cricket Club this morning, and I'm here because not so long ago, so was Sir Keir Starmer and the Deputy Leader of the Labour Party, Angela Rayner, and of course the brand new Labour MP for Blackpool South, Chris Webb. They've been here greeting activists, thanking them for all their work this morning, and doing a bit of a sort of a rally to really mark this moment, because Sir Keir Starmer has called this win in Blackpool South seismic. The size of the swing, 26% swing from the Conservatives to Labour, far more than Labour says it would need to win a majority at a general election. So they are very keen to mark this moment. And Sir Keir Starmer had a particular message that he wanted Rishi Sunak to take from this.
Look, we want that general election, and we're confident going into that general election, because what this by-election shows is that the country wants change. This is a very clear divide now. We've had 14 years of failure and decline. We've just got chaos and division from the Tories. People want to turn the page on that and go forward with Labour and our positive plan for the country.
Now, celebrating this morning then for Labour, not so much for the Conservatives, who've got a lot to chew over from the result in Blackpool South last night. Not only losing votes in such large numbers to Labour, but they also seem to have lost a sizable chunk of their vote to Reform. And there was at one point during the evening a thought that Reform may even have pipped them to get into second place. They didn't. The Conservatives did manage to stave off what would have been an absolute nightmare scenario for them in that case, but only by the case of about 100 or so votes. So I think there's going to be a lot of chewing over for the Conservatives to do. Their vote has collapsed here. It's down 30 percentage points. You know, they are going to have to really look at what happened here last night. For Labour, though, a Conservative spokesperson had suggested that this was always going to be difficult for them, given the circumstances surrounding why this by-election came about in the first place, relating to the previous MP here, Scott Benton. But I think Labour this morning, you can see their celebration, their jubilation at this, and seeing what they see as a really important result.
And just on how we can kind of, I suppose, draw a wider lesson from this, Helen, what are the kind of factors there that you think that are encouraging for Labour, or anything potentially that this is the usual by-election typical result?
Well, by-elections are always pretty volatile, and turnouts, of course, are lower than they are in general elections. So, for example, here the turnout was 32.5% this time. At the last general, it was around 57%. So there are slight differences between by-elections and general elections. But when you talk to the various parties, when I was talking to them last night, you know, the message that Labour are saying is, look, they want change, that voters have said, no, this is time, we want change. And whether they've gone to Labour or to Reform for that, they are moving away from the Conservatives. The Conservatives, on the other hand, think that they had quite a good story to tell in Blackpool South in terms of the amount of money that they put into the town, but that clearly hasn't really registered on the doorsteps, and I think they will need to go away and look at why that might be. So quite a lot to think about in this result.
Helen, great stuff. Thank you for that. Let's go to Westminster now. Our political correspondent Ben Wright is standing by for us. Ben, good to see you. I want to ask you about things, particular details that have stood out to you in a moment. But first of all, can you just give us the broad brush, top line, top story? What is the story of the night so far?
Well, I think it is that parliamentary by-election at the moment. Blackpool South, another rout for the Conservatives, the latest in a series since the beginning of 2023. Sir Keir Starmer waking up to the fifth emphatic Labour win in a by-election, which would suggest that he is currently on course to become Prime Minister in a few months, if the current trend continues and the Tories can't manage to dig themselves out of the electoral hole that they are in. So I think overnight, that is the standout result. The picture in terms of councils is emerging. I mean, we're still early days, remember. We've still got many, many, many more councils who will declare their results during the course of the day and into tomorrow. So this is a sort of preliminary picture we're getting. But I think some results do stand out and are potentially very significant. The fact that Labour did take the council in Hartlepool, a place where it had terrible results back in 2021, both at the council level but also losing a parliamentary constituency too. They're back in control in Hartlepool in the northeast, but they're also back in control in Thurrock in the southeast, another strongly Leave voting area where Labour has completely come back into contention and now runs that council. I'd also highlight Rushmore in Hampshire. You know, this has been a pretty Tory area for several years, and now Labour have that council. So I think across England you're starting to see bits of the map turning red that will really cheer Labour Party HQ. But as I said, these are early days still, and I think it's the mayoral races that we'll be talking about by the end of the day. Well, one in particular, the Tees Valley race, where the Tory Ben Houchin is seeking re-election. We won't know about the West Midlands and London and some of the other mayoral races until tomorrow. But I think the next big thing to look out for will be the result in Tees Valley, which we should get around lunchtime.
Yeah, Ben, I want to just press you a bit more on that. Mark our card for us. Map out the next day or two about what we should be looking out for and what can expect.
Well, a swathe of councils will declare as we get through into the late morning and into the afternoon, which will give us a very good picture. We'll be looking at, you know, a whole raft of them to work out whether the pattern is continuing, whether the Conservative and Labour results are really mirroring the opinion polls that we've seen over the last few months as well. At the moment, the early results suggest that they do. So council results to look out for. But as I said, I think the big one next, Lewis, will be the Tees Valley race. I think the Conservatives are, or have been in the last few days, relatively confident of holding on and for Ben Houchin being re-elected in Tees Valley. He won with a massive vote in 2021. I think it was 72%. He managed to get the mayoralty. The question is, you know, does he hang on this time? He, like lots of the mayors across England, really have a big personal brand that in some ways is a slightly separate from the party brand, and I think he will be hoping that keeps him in post in Tees Valley. If he doesn't hold on, I think that will be an absolutely devastating blow for the Tories.
OK, I want to ask you about Oldham, because Nick Eardley gave us some of the numbers, the breakdown. It's an interesting potential Achilles heel for Labour, I think he described it as. How do you see the issue about what happened there in Oldham?
Yeah, I think Nick is absolutely right that you saw independent candidates gaining seats at the expense of Labour because of their strongly pro-Gaza stance. And clearly Labour was hurt in Oldham. Later on today, we'll see results in places like Burnley and Sheffield, and we may see a repeat of that pattern, and that is something that will clearly be causing some jitters in the Labour Party as they think about their prospects in really urban seats with big Muslim populations. You know, how is their stance on the Israel-Gaza war going to play at the ballot box, not just in the results we're going to see over the next 24, 48 hours, but as we head on towards the general election too.
I bet we do, of course, spend a lot of time looking ahead to the general election, interpreting what these results mean when it comes to a general election. But can we just look at the results in their own rights, I suppose, in their own... What does it mean? What difference does it make to people's lives when, for example, a council switches hands, when it drops into no overall control? What kind of decisions are these local politicians making that have any impact on people's lives?
Well, huge impact, and I think for a lot of people, perhaps it's their most direct day-to-day experience of the decision-making that politicians have. It determines, how their local councils are run, how their roads are managed. I mean, on a variety of fronts, how the social care is operating in a particular area. Decisions that are made that really affects people. These are decisions that are down to local councils, local authorities. So, yeah, and they're responsible for very, very large budgets too. So they do have a big impact. And you're right, Lewis, to point that out. We shouldn't forget that in all the speculation about what this means for the national leaders and the general election. These elections are important in of themselves. And the same applies to the Police and Crime Commissioner elections that are happening at the same time. But inevitably, so close to a general election, this will have a large bearing on the mood within the parties, on their strategies, where the areas that they need to concentrate on to either build up their support or play a more defensive game. This will all be really important as they head towards the general election. And for Rishi Sunak, clearly, he knows that he is leading a despondent and dejected Conservative Party at the moment. They can see the opinion polls. They can see the actual results coming in now. They know they have an absolutely huge electoral mountain to climb if they've got any chance of hanging on at the general election. And at the moment, this is going to do nothing to lift that sort of despondent mood within his ranks.
Ben, thank you so much for that. Speak to you a bit later. We're going to cross now to Sir John Curtice, Professor of Politics at the University of Strathclyde. Great to see you. Right, what are the numbers telling you?
Well, there are two principal messages that are coming out of these local election results together with the parliamentary by-election in Blackpool. The first is that so far as the gap between Conservative and Labour is concerned, nothing very much seems to have changed. In one sense, that sounds like a surprising statement because the swing from Conservative to Labour in Blackpool South at just over 26% is the third biggest swing in post-war electoral history. Trouble is, swings of that kind of size have now become rather commonplace in the last year or so. We've actually had 5 by-elections in which the swing from Conservative to Labour has been over 20%. So that in that sense, it's more of the same. It's a set of parliamentary by-elections of the kind that we have really not seen since the 92 to 97 Parliament, which of course ended in defeat for the Conservatives. Equally, if we look at the detailed voting figures that the BBC has been collecting overnight, and there's many of them more yet still to come, but so far at least it looks as though, if anything, support for the Conservatives in these local elections is a wee bit down on last year. Support for the Labour Party certainly holding firm, maybe very slightly higher. Anyway, either way, there's no evidence here of any closing of the gap that between Labour and the Conservatives, any narrowing of the Labour lead. So again, we've got more of the same, just indeed as the opinion polls have been suggesting. The one difference, but again it's anticipated by the opinion polls, is that Reform UK were performing more strongly than they did last year, though they still didn't fight that many of the wards. But crucially for the Conservatives, their intervention in Blackpool South almost created the embarrassment of getting the Conservatives ending up in 3rd place. And in local council elections, places like Sunderland, for example, where again Reform did particularly well, you discover that it's the Conservative Party in particular that seems to suffer. And that again has been a message of opinion polls, but it's really a development of only the last 3, 4, 5 months ago. So it does basically mean the Conservatives are still in as much trouble as they were a year ago, with the added twist that they now have 2 parties biting into their vote, i.e. Labour and Reform, rather than just perhaps one for the most part 12 months ago.
Interesting. And on the numbers, what will you be working on this morning and this afternoon to try and get the best possible picture to try and translate over to any general election?
Well, there are two things that will be going on during the course of today. The first is we will be looking at the scale of the Conservative losses. At the moment, they're losing 1 seat in 2, which means they could end up losing 500 seats, which was widely suggested before the elections. That would be a bad result. But the second big thing we'll be doing with those detailed voting figures that I've already referred to is coming up with what we call the projected national share, which is not a forecast of the general election in 6 months' time, not even a statement of what might have happened if we'd had a general election on Thursday, but rather an estimate of what would have happened if the whole country had had local elections on Thursday, because only bits of England did, and people behaved in these local elections in much the same way as those parts of the country that did have local elections. And that's something we do every year. And so you'll have to wait and see what we come up with. I'll just say to you that last year, Labour on this estimate were at 35%, the Conservatives down at 26%, and the Liberal Democrats at 20%. The Liberal Democrats always do better on this estimate and in local elections than in the national opinion polls. So that's our benchmark. We have to wait and see what our calculation comes up with when we've got a lot more results, shall we say, probably the second half of the afternoon.
Professor Curtice, great stuff, great to talk to you, and we will be back with you when you have those numbers. And thank you again for reminding us of the caveat that actually we are still waiting on a lot of results as well. Right, we're going to get a bit of the political reaction now to what's happened so far. The chair of the Conservatives, Richard Holden. First, let's hear from him.
My heart goes out to a lot of my Conservative colleagues who I've been campaigning with out across the country, who've lost their seats overnight. And although we've only seen around a third of councils, a couple of the PCCs and none of the big mayoral contests yet, obviously some disappointing results so far. But also, some areas like Fareham and Harlow where we've managed to hold Conservative councils, and up in Newcastle on Tyne where we've finally got a Conservative councillor on there for the first time in 32 years. But overall, a disappointing night for us.
And the Conservative MP, Dame Andrea Jenkins, who has previously called for Rishi Sunak to resign, says the party needs to change.
I think the last 24 hours, I think for Rishi, he's got a message, he's been told by the electorate, wake up, be Conservative or we lose. I think that is the actual message that's come through. I mean, the by-election result, yes, we've been doing disastrous in by-elections, but I think what that's demonstrated is that, Reform can't muster enough votes to win seats, but they can hand seats to Labour.
Well, support for the Conservatives was lower in every area where they were up against candidates from Reform UK. The former Tory MP, Lee Anderson, who's Reform's only MP, says it was a strong showing for his party.
We're here to stay. We're making inroads. We're a small party. We're polling 3 to 5% last year. Now we're polling around the 15% mark. Our trajectory is going up and up and up, and the Tory party is going down and down and down. And come the general election, this party is going to win seats. So a vote for Reform will be...
Well, the Liberal Democrats have made modest gains so far, remaining in control of 4 local authorities they were defending. The party's deputy leader, Daisy Cooper, told BBC Breakfast many people have been voting tactically.
We've seen that in the 4 stunning by-election wins that we've had during this Parliament as well, where again a number of Labour voters decided to vote for our Liberal Democrat candidates. And so our message really is, if you want to get rid of this Conservative government, in many places around the country, in 80 seats, voting for the Liberal Democrats is the best way of getting rid of the Conservative MP.
And the co-leader of the Green Party, Carla Denyer, is standing in the next general election. She says tonight's local election results are good for her chances.
Although the previous constituency of Bristol West was already a promising one for the Greens, it's even more so with the boundary changes. We think those changes are roughly halve the Labour majority on their own, not accounting for the fact that voters' opinions, the leadership of the Labour Party has changed, a number of other factors locally and nationally. And simply my experience speaking to voters on the doorstep, voters are really, really sick of this Conservative government and the way they've run this country into the ground over the last 14 years, but they're not really feeling inspired by what Keir Starmer's Labour Party is offering, and they're really excited at the opportunity to vote and elect the city's first Green MP.
So that's some of the political reaction. We're going to speak now to Katie Balls, political editor at The Spectator. Thanks very much for coming on the programme.
Thanks.
Let's start with the Conservatives, shall we? It's a bad night for them. How bad, in your assessment?
Pretty bad. I think probably approaching awful if you think about the historical comparisons. Obviously, the Tories will say it's far from over yet. There's still lots more results to come in. And that is true. But I think if you listen to the pollsters, we're still getting a fair flavour in terms of different parts of the country. And the news just isn't very good for them in terms of losing council seats. The Blackpool by-election, ultimately Labour took that with a very comfortable majority. That's the, now the second ever Labour MP there, so that should be a stronghold. Now, I think they'll be taking some light relief from the fact they narrowly managed to stop Reform from coming second in that seat, but it was only by 100 or so votes. So they avoid some of the worst headlines they might have got, but the Reform problem is still very much there. And I think right now, if you were a Tory minister sent out on the airwaves, you don't have too much to point to. You're going to hear a lot about Harlow, where they've managed to hold off Labour taking control of the council. But there's a little bit Wandsworth and Westminster, in the past when Tories have had bad results and they just cling on to a couple. They'll be hoping that Ben Houchen, the Tees Valley mayor, is re-elected this afternoon, because that will give them another thing to point to, because right now it's pretty slim pickings if you want to have a positive story for the Tory party on its results.
Interesting. Let's spend a moment on, the Reform problem that you just, as you phrased it there, for the Conservatives. Let's expand a bit on that, because when there was a Reform candidate, clearly they didn't stand in every seat. But where they did, it did seem to impact the Conservatives' vote share. Talk us through the history of Reform, just remind us who they are and why they're a potential problem for the Conservatives.
So Reform was born from the Brexit Party, which obviously stood in 2019, led by Nigel Farage. Obviously, Brexit was delivered, in the technical sense at least, after the election, and therefore they became the Reform Party. Richard Tice, Nigel Farage still backs it, but isn't front of centre yet. And effectively, they're on the right of the Tory party. And I think that means there's a big question of, do they divide the Tory vote? And up until, I think, probably today, where the Reform Party are in general intention polling tends to be higher than where they are when they have an actual electoral test. The problem for the Tories is in the local elections, and as you say, they haven't stood in many places, but they did pretty well in Blackpool. I think that's their best by-election performance to date. And then in the wards they've stood in, they're getting on average about 14%. And in those wards, it's the Tory candidate that's really suffering as a result. So it's going to confirm the fear of Tory MPs that the effect of the Reform Party is to really reduce their chances and increase Labour's chances. And that means that if it is replicated on scale in a general election, that can have quite a devastating effect in terms of the type of loss the Tories have. So I think this result is not going to provide much comfort, particularly because there are rumours that Nigel Farage in a week or two's time might say that he's taking a more active role in the party, which is something Tories have also feared for giving it more momentum.
Interesting. Right, let's move away from Reform towards Rishi Sunak. What do you think the results so far mean for him?
I mean, they're tricky. I think, obviously, this has always been the big danger point for Rishi Sunak since he became Prime Minister. The last year's local elections results were pretty bad for the Prime Minister. I think they stalled any recovery narrative, but they were so soon after he took over, no one really was going to say, oh, we blame him, he has to go. This has always had more potential. Now, so far, we're not really getting that sense from Tory MPs, but I think in Downing Street and in the Parliamentary Party, there has always been a bit of a fear that if the results are really bad, by the end of the weekend, MPs are back in Parliament on Tuesday, you could start to see a move against him. Now, we are some way off that, but the results, I have to say, are probably on the worst end of things right now, which is why the Prime Minister will be hoping that he starts to have a few things he can point to on top of Harlow, on top of the odd police and crime commissioner. So that could be a Metro mayor, better results elsewhere, because he needs a story to tell to try and reassure his MPs. And if he doesn't, that's when they can start to get quite spooked.
Katie, thank you very much for that. Just want to bring in Ava Santina Effens now alongside political correspondent for Politics, Joe. Thanks very much for coming on the programme. Let's look at the Labour perspective from this. If you were Keir Starmer, how would you be feeling?
Well, you'd be quite pleased with the results. I mean, it's what the worst result for the Tories in about 40 years in a local election. And, it's about the same as where they were in 95, which I don't need to tell you is just before they lost that catastrophic election in 97. However, I would be concerned about the leadership's position on Israel-Gaza, because if you look towards places like Oldham, where they have lost seats to independent candidates who are specifically speaking on a one mandate, which is on the Israel-Gaza position, I'd be looking towards those ahead of a general election to reconsider their current position. Because if you're someone, say, like the Shadow Health Secretary, like Wes Streeting, where you're in a sort of marginal seat down in Ilford, and you also have a candidate who's running on a similar mandate, you might question whether that's a position they should reconsider.
Interesting. Katie, can I get your thoughts on that, on what the kind of decisions that Keir Starmer will have to be making on this issue and whether any policy changes would be necessary?
Yeah, I mean, Labour have moved their position on a ceasefire. The problem is that lots of the voters who feel isolated by Labour's position remember Labour's old position. They remember how long they took to get to the new ceasefire position. And there's also that clip of Keir Starmer on LBC soon after party conference last year, where he was asked about, cutting off electricity and so forth from Gaza, and appeared to suggest something that he thought this could be a way Israel could defend itself. He, after some days, clarified his position, but the clip still lives on and is shared in various WhatsApp groups, and it's something that I think has come back to haunt the Labour Party. So I think they are in a tricky position there, and I think we have had enough in terms of the early results here, but also if you look at George Galloway's election in that by-election to suggest that there is a backlash towards Labour, which can be part traced to its position on Israel-Gaza. And that is tricky. It means that you could get some quite quirky results, whereby Labour could be on course for a landslide or at least a large majority, but yet some seats such as Bristol, where Thangam Debonair is the Shadow Culture Secretary, she could find herself losing her seat to the Greens and so forth. So I think the Labour Party will be trying to reflect on what they can do here, but I think it's not as simple as just changing your position now because of all the events that have led up to it.
Ava, back to you, sticking with Labour. The message from Keir Starmer, as we heard just in the last hour, talking about basically wanting Rishi Sunak to call an election time. It's time to move forward with Labour. We're going to hear those kind of messages. We have been hearing them for a while and will continue to do so. What do you think about that as a strategy and Labour's position more broadly away from the specific issue of the Israel-Gaza war?
Well, I think that Labour are getting quite tired with having to keep mirroring the Conservative Party. I think that what we've seen over the last year is essentially Labour policy has been a de facto copy of whatever the Conservatives have been doing. We've seen that through the gender critical advice. We've also seen that through advice on inflation, and we've seen it on we've seen it throughout the cost of living crisis. And I think they're sort of running out of road on that, and they need to get to a point where they can actually start announcing the sort of policies that they'd like to bring in once they get into government, or if they get into government. And so there seems to be a sort of fatigue amongst activists where they're turning up on the doorstep and they don't have anything new to tell constituents other than, look, the Conservatives are doing absolutely terribly. How bad could it be if we are to get into government? But, I do really think the Israel-Gaza point is really important. You've heard Pat McFadden out this morning, who's Labour's national election coordinator. He's been out and about this morning and he's been talking about the position. And he said, look, it has come up on the doorstep and it is something that we're going to have to reconsider. I mean, particularly if you look in London and Sadiq Khan's campaign, the result of which we are going to get tomorrow, probably around midday, 1 o'clock. His team have been really concentrating on the issue, and they've been out and about flying about it. They have been on the doorstep, banging the drum that Sadiq Khan is very much for a ceasefire. And if you're a younger voter, you can trust in him that he'll pressure the Labour leadership into changing their position.
Interesting. Katie, back to you. Can we just spend a moment on Liberal Democrats, the Greens, Independents perhaps, but just smaller parties away from the big two and the impact of reform? Anything stood out from you?
Yeah, I mean, I think you're seeing inroads. I mean, the Green Party seems to be benefiting to a degree from some of the votes that are leaving Labour. And some of that can potentially be traced to Israel-Palestine. That's been an argument that's been made by some Green politicians. We're going to have the Bristol count later today. Of course, that is where one of the co-Green leaders is trying to eventually win a seat in a general election. So that will be an interesting test of Greens versus Labour. And on the Liberal Democrats, I think Wokingham is going to be really interesting because, if you think about John Redwood in that seat, it's a true blue technically council, but there is hope they could potentially make it into a Lib Dem one, in which case things are going to feel quite different. And at that point, I think you'll start to feel this Tory squeeze, if that comes to be the case, where the Liberal Democrats are making inroads in the blue wall, Labour making inroads in the red wall, and the Reform Party is helping Labour to do that. And it begins to raise the question of where is the core vote for the Tories these days? Is there one? Because nowhere is looking particularly safe right now.
Well, if that's the case, Ava, where do you think that leaves Rishi Sunak's position?
We're quite comforted today by the result in Blackpool South, particularly because Reform didn't really seem to make much of a dent. I know that it was their biggest turnout, their biggest result in a by-election so far. It was around 17%, but it still wasn't enough to clinch the Conservative vote. So if you are coordinating an election at the moment, you'll be looking at Reform and you'll be thinking, okay, well, it might actually, cut our vote slightly, but it's not enough to take a seat from us, which will be quite a big breath of relief. I mean, also, if you look around at the Liberal Democrats and the Greens had a pretty catastrophic result in Blackpool South. I think they picked up around 300 votes, which, you'd be thinking we need to go back to the drawing board here and think, why on earth are we doing so terribly in the face of a Conservative government that is, well, by all accounts, pretty unappealing to the electorate.
Ava, thank you so much. Katie, thank you so much as well. Great to have you both on and your thoughts picking over the results as we have them so far. I should usual caveat here, we are still a long way from knowing the complete picture. Lots of results due to come, new ones starting to come in around lunchtime, but it will be in fact into the weekend before we actually get the full picture. But thus far, not a great night for the Conservatives, which means pretty good night for Labour. And so the Labour leader, Sir Keir Starmer, has been out and about in Blackpool because they won Blackpool South. Take a listen.
Look, we want that general election and we're confident going into that general election because what this by-election shows is that the country wants change. This is a very clear divide now. We've had 14 years of failure and decline. We've just got chaos and division from the Tories. People want to turn the page on that and go forward with Labour and our positive plan for the country.
It's not a direct yes. Why so cautious when you've had such a big win this morning?
We want a general election. We want to win that general election. We want to take our country forward. And I thank every single person who voted Labour yesterday and put their trust in a changed Labour Party. But, politics and by-elections are about messages. And obviously there's a lot of discussion now. What does this mean? I think it's really straightforward. People have had enough. They want to turn the page. They want to go forward with Labour. They know we've got a positive case. And I think now, that's a direct message to the Prime Minister. The most direct of all these results that we're coming, many are in, more to come. But this was a direct message to the Prime Minister, which is, make way, let's have a general election. Let's allow our country now to go forward.
And just quickly before you let you move on to some other people, how concerned are you about the impact your Gaza position is having on your vote in some areas of the country?
Well, obviously, I'm concerned wherever we lose votes, and we intend to win any votes we've lost back. But there's no denying that across the country, whether it's Hartlepool in the north or Rushmore in the south or Redditch with Bellwether seat, we are winning votes across the country. And that, I think, reflects a changed Labour Party with a positive case to take to the country. So I'm very pleased with the results. Blackpool is an incredible result, but we're picking up seats where we need them in other parts of the country as well.
So, Keir Starmer, they're pretty happy, as you'd expect with that result in Blackpool South, what it's saying for the national picture from his perspective. But, of course, the most important thing for the people of Blackpool South is they have a new MP. Chris Webb is his name. Let's take a listen to him.
The people of Blackpool South have spoken for Britain. They have said to Rishi Sunak and to the Conservatives they've had enough. They've had enough for 14 years of the Conservatives being in power. They have lost trust of the British people, and Blackpool has had enough of this failed government, which has crashed the economy, destroyed our public services and put up taxes. They have said that it's time for change, and that change started here in Blackpool tonight. Only Labour offers new hopes for towns like Blackpool. We need change, and we will get it under a Labour government. I want to thank the returning officer, my election agent, Liam Didsbury, election staff and the police for the smooth running of this election and count. I know it takes a lot of work to put this on, so I thank you for your professionalism, your commitment to the democratic process. I'd also like to thank my entire campaign team and the wider Labour movement. Blackpool South is the 23rd parliamentary by-election of this Parliament, and it's down to each and every one of you for your sacrifices that have made sure we've turned Blackpool South red once again. And thank you to my amazing family who have given me endless support over the years, and to my incredible wife Portia for all her support and sacrifices she's made, especially in these last few weeks, and looking after our newborn son Killian. And thank you to my mum, dad and sister watching in Australia who have supported me all these years. Above all though, I'd like to thank the people of Blackpool South who have put their trust in me to be the next Member of Parliament. It's a huge privilege to represent the seat that I call home and have been born and bred in, where we've not had a local MP for 60 years. The circumstances that led to this by-election have been well documented. I believe many people in Blackpool have been left with little faith in politicians because of the behaviour of others. To them I say I'm humbled by your support, that every ward in this town voted for me. Whether you voted for me or not though, I promise to work for you every day to earn your trust and restore the faith in politics. I promise I won't let you down. I have said this all along, that I am in it for Blackpool, and I mean it. I will put the priorities of this town first and fight for residents in Westminster and challenge this government to get a better deal for Blackpool. I have spoken to so many during this campaign and had the same conversations. People are fed up because nothing seems to work anymore, hard up because of the Conservative cost of living crisis, but instead of giving up, they got up and voted for change with Labour. It is not acceptable that Blackpool has the highest crime rate in Lancashire, with neighbourhood police officers cut by 43%. Right, it's not acceptable that the Conservatives have allowed some parts of our town to be run down without a plan to rejuvenate them. And it's not acceptable that in Blackpool South, in parts, more children live in poverty because of the decisions this government have made. People in Blackpool South and across the country are sick of the government's failure and to tackle the big issues facing our country. In this election, we offered a plan for Blackpool that was positive, a plan to put more police on the streets, deliver the regeneration our town needs and help hard-working families through the cost of living crisis. Only Keir Starmer's Labour Party has the vision and the ideas to make life better for everyone in our country. Change is what people want, and up and down the country, Labour is the party they're looking for to deliver it. Blackpool South has said that loud and clear tonight. The message to the Prime Minister is that we need a general election, sooner the better. People no longer trust the Conservatives. Prime Minister, do the decent thing. Admit you've failed and call a general election. Give the people of Britain the same opportunity people in Blackpool South have, a Labour Member of Parliament and Keir Starmer in Downing Street. And let Labour get on with delivering the change the people of Britain want and deserve.
So that was Chris Webb giving his victory speech, new MP there, Labour MP for Blackpool South. So what does this mean for the Conservatives and the Conservative leadership under Rishi Sunak? Well, here's the thoughts of Conservative commentator Tim Montgomery.
I asked different people in the Conservative Party, what if the Tories won a majority, would the Conservatives do with it? And you don't have coherent answers. Rishi Sunak hasn't used the 18 months he's had as Prime Minister to show the voters that he wants to build houses, he wants to invest in vocational education. It's not really clear, other than stopping the boats, what his big message is. And that's partly the reason why the Conservative Party is, I think, in the bad place that it is. When the results are as bad as they have been tonight, with so many good Conservatives losing their seats, this isn't a midterm, this is the end of the Parliament. Time is running out, and I think Rishi Sunak really hasn't used the time he's had.
That was Tim Montgomery there. Now, the Reform Party came third in the Blackpool South by-election, not far behind the Conservatives. And Reform UK's leader, Richard Tice, says the party is looking to the future.
We've been focusing on getting ready for a general election. We think that could well be in the summer. We'll be ready for it whenever it is, and continuing to make great progress because, frankly, the country's broken, nothing works. We're in the longest recession for 70 years since records began per person. Of course, that's what actually matters. And the truth is, Britain needs reform. Our economy needs reform. Our health system needs reform. And our immigration needs to be frozen. Our immigration system needs reform. So wherever you look, people are actually saying there must be someone out there with some common sense policies. And that's why, as people hear about us, they're saying, I like what I hear. And that's why people are starting to vote for us. You know, you look at the percentages we got in Sunderland and elsewhere as results get declared. We've also got the mayoral elections. We're excited about how we're going to perform in those relative to the Conservatives. It's, you know, as I say, Rome's not built in a day, but we are making great progress. And all these results are showing that we're achieving more than our national polling average. And that's an important indicator.
Richard Tice there. Right, we're going to speak now to the MP for North East Fife, Wendy Chamberlain, also Liberal Democrats Chief Whip. Thank you very much for coming on the programme.
Morning, nice to be here.
So we've spent a bit of time there on the story of the night so far for Labour, pretty good. Story of the night so far for the Conservatives, pretty bad. It's difficult to find the story for the Liberal Democrats, isn't it?
No, I would disagree with that. I think we have a very good story to tell. Look, it's obviously very early days and we're hopeful of seeing real progress in places like Tunbridge Wells, Wokingham and Dorset later on today. But if you look at it, so far all 4 councils that we were defending, we've won, including in Hull, for example, where we were facing off against Labour. And we've made gains in places like Fareham and Suella Braverman's backyard. And so I think where we are looking and we're expecting to make progress, that's exactly what we've done.
And what do you think this will translate to in a general election? Is there enough momentum there?
Well, as you will be aware, there was 80 seats that we were second to the Conservatives with in 2019, and we're very clear about the work we are doing to ensure that we bring as many Liberal Democrat MPs to Parliament as possible. And when you look again at the results overnight in places like Eastleigh, in Cheadle, in Hazel Grove, we have won the popular vote in those constituencies. So that demonstrates to me that we are making the right progress as we look to the general election, which frankly can't come soon enough.
The reputation of the Liberal Democrats, as you know, is they overperform in local elections, elections in between general elections effectively, and then underperform during the general election. So if you're pointing to the positives there, are you clear that you've dispelled that stereotype of the Liberal Democrats?
I think we've made, this is going to be looking like the local elections where for the 6th time in a row, the Liberal Democrats have made progress, and we've never done that as a party. We've also won over 650 councillors in this term of Parliament, which is more than any other party. So I really think that we are making huge progress, and it's quite clear when you look at the 4 by-election wins that we have had in this Parliament, that where we focus our resources, we do well, particularly given that the Conservatives are in freefall.
Do you want a general election sooner rather than later?
Absolutely. It's quite clear that there is a very strong and consistent message that the voters are giving to the Conservatives. What else can they do in the time left remaining to them? Rishi Sunak should accept that now is the time for a general election.
When you were listening, I'm sure you would have heard Sir Keir Starmer there up in Blackpool South talking about that messaging towards Rishi Sunak. It's stale, time for a change, get out the way, country move forward under Labour. Is that messaging pretty similar to your messaging, and does that encourage you or worry you?
Well, I think it's quite clear that change is a narrative that is coming forward. Now, obviously, I've not had elections in North East Fife. There are no local elections in Scotland until 2027. But certainly what I'm hearing is change. And that is true not just in relation to Conservatives, but here in Scotland, it's relation to the SNP, where it looks like we are going to have a new First Minister, 3 First Ministers in the same amount of time that the Conservatives have brought forward Prime Ministers. And there's a need for change here in Scotland too.
Yes, we have talked a lot about Scotland and we will again, but not right now. Wendy Chamberlain, thank you so much for coming on. Great to talk to you. Thank you.
Thanks for your time.
Now, Labour's National Campaign Coordinator Pat McFadden told BBC Breakfast earlier that it had been a good night for the party.
The most significant result overnight is the Blackpool South by-election, where we've won a stunning victory, a 26% swing, with the Tories barely hanging on to second place. And elsewhere in the local council elections, gains like in Hartlepool in the north, which you've just been discussing, in Rushmore in the south. So we're feeling good. We fought a good positive campaign. The results are good for us overnight so far, and of course we've got a lot more to come over the next couple of days.
Right, let's cross live now to Blackpool. Our reporter, Rowan Bridge, is there. Hi, Rowan. Just remind us what happened there.
Well, Keir Starmer's been using words like seismic and historic for the Labour victory that you had in Blackpool here last night. A 26% swing to Labour. That's the third biggest swing from the Conservatives to Labour since 1945, and so no doubt it's a really significant result here for Labour, and I don't think it's any surprise that we saw Keir Starmer and Angela Rayner, the deputy leaders, both in the constituents here this morning, making the most of the victory they got last night. A really quite difficult night for the Conservative Party. They were almost forced into third place here. They were almost beaten by Reform UK. They only squeaked in by about 100 votes into second place. So a really disastrous night for the Conservatives here, as something that they've sort of tried to play down, saying that they were aware it was always going to be a difficult situation for them, given some of the local circumstances here in Blackpool. Scott Benson, the MP who resigned and forced this by-election, had been suspended from the Conservative Party over a lobbying scandal, and I think that had sort of tainted the Conservative brand somewhat, and that and the lead that Keir Starmer's had nationally clearly have both played out here in Blackpool South overnight.
And Rowan, what's the interesting takeaway from that Sir Keir Starmer speech that struck you? Where he was there at, what was it, just about an hour or so ago now?
Well, I think what was interesting is that, you know, he's clearly, you could see the buoyancy in the mood. But interestingly, when he spoke to Helen Catt afterwards, you still got this sense of caution around Keir Starmer's attitude to all of this. He was sort of calling for a general election, but even now, I think Keir Starmer is worried about Labour getting over their skis in terms of appearing too presumptive about what the result of any general election would be. I mean, bear in mind, the turnout here in Blackpool was only about a third of the electorate. 2/3 of people didn't bother to vote. And, you know, this is a snapshot of opinion overnight in local councils. And, you know, a general election may not come till the end of the year. And I think the sense I got was that Keir Starmer is just being ultra cautious. He doesn't want Labour to feel too presumptuous ahead of any general election. And I think they're still scarred by their memories of 1992 and what happened then. And they don't want a repeat of that. They're looking for something more like 1997 and Tony Blair's victory then.
Rowan, thank you very much. Great to have you on the programme. We'll be back in Blackpool throughout the day because it was the one parliamentary by-election and, of course, the result of that being celebrated by that man there. That's the new MP, Chris Webb, for Blackpool South. But not celebrated just by him, of course, by Sir Keir Starmer and many in the Labour leadership, hoping basically that the size of the swing there. So, of course, the win was pretty much predicted and expected, but the size of the swing, historically high, and they will be taking some comfort from that, setting aside, of course, what Rowan was outlining there, some local issues, the controversy around the previous MP. But Chris Webb and Sir Keir Starmer repeating their message to Rishi Sunak, the Conservative Prime Minister. They want to see an election immediately. They say the country wants change. The country wants to move forward with Labour. their message. But this isn't just about how these results transfer to the proposed general election by the end of the year. This is also, of course, about local elections on local issues, local politicians changing and influencing the lives of their local populations. And we have seen the results coming through. So far, 35 of 107 councils. Labour up 52 councillors. Conservatives down 122. Liberal Democrats up 18. Independents up 39. And the Greens up 13. Stay with us for all the results, the days ahead. I'm Lewis Vaughan-Jones. This is BBC News. So, as I mentioned there, the days ahead, because this isn't like a normal general election where we have pretty much all the results overnight and then we know what's going on the next morning. Not the case. We're expecting, there's a little lull in actual results coming through right now. Lunchtime things pick up again, and even then into the weekend until we get the full picture of who has won what and where. I want to show you this, though. There was a bit of a headache for former Prime Minister Boris Johnson. He was turned away from his polling station when he went to vote in the local elections there because he forgot to bring his photo ID. And that is actually a requirement that he brought in when he was Prime Minister. So he brought in that law and then he fell foul of it. It was back in 2022, making it compulsory for voters in England to show photo ID, and he didn't have the right photo ID. We understand he did go back home, collect the right ID, and then went back and then was actually able to vote. And we have been hearing that the new voter ID rules will have, of course, impacted some people, but largely didn't have a great impact. Right, you are watching BBC News. I'm Lewis Vaughan-Jones. Plenty more coverage coming up. Live from London, this is BBC News. Big Conservative losses in local elections across England, with the party potentially facing its worst night at the polls in 4 decades. Labour win the Blackpool South by-election with a 26% swing of the vote. Sir Keir Starmer hails the party's performance and has this message.
We want that general election, and we're confident going into that general election, because what this by-election shows is that the country wants change.
The Lib Dems have retained all the councils they held, while it's been a strong night for the Green Party. More than half the results, including the mayoral contests in England's major cities, yet to be declared. We'll bring you the latest. Hello, welcome to the programme. I'm Lewis Vaughan-Jones. We'll be steering our way through all the elections that we've had in, looking at what they mean and, of course, what is coming up next. Now, should stress right at the beginning, not all the results are in yet. We may have to wait until Saturday for the full picture. But so far, it looks like the Conservatives are having a tough time. They've lost around half the council seats they were defending. That's actually similar to how they performed back in 1995. You remember 2 years after that, they were crushed at that general election. Labour, the Greens and the Liberal Democrats all made gains, and Labour are celebrating a victory in the Blackpool South by-election with a huge swing from the Conservatives. With the story of the night, here's our political correspondent, Damien Grammaticus.
Commonly known as Chris, Labour Party, 10,825.
Blackpool South, a little before 5 a.m, and a decisive Labour victory. They were confident of emerging winners in the by-election, but this was emphatic.
They have said to Rishi Sunak and to the Conservatives, they've had enough. They've had enough for 14 years of the Conservatives being in power. They have lost trust of the British people, and Blackpool has had enough of this failed government.
The Conservatives, who had held the seat, were beaten into second place, but the shock for Tories will be that Reform very nearly pushed them into third.
They didn't get Brexit done properly, they didn't cut immigration, and people are tired and sick and tired of the Tory incompetence and lies. We're done with it. We're done with the Tories. It's time for change. It's time for reform.
And the first council of the night to change control, Hartlepool.
Q&A at Bailey Fleet, Labour and Cooperative Party, 649 votes.
The Conservatives lost 6 councillors here, Labour in charge again. The win is symbolic for them, clawing back lost ground.
Day, Thomas William, Labour Party, 806.
In Rushmore in Hampshire, Labour have taken control directly from the Conservatives. Boundary changes helped here, but it's also been gaining wards from Tories. Mounting losses, an unwelcome sight for the Conservative minister at the count. And in North East Lincolnshire, more Labour cheer.
Wow.
Conservatives lost control of the council here. Grimsby is exactly the sort of place Labour will hope to win back at the general election.
Sadly, in local elections, they tend to mirror the polls at national level, and clearly it's a statement of the obvious. We're far behind in the polls nationally, and people have followed through at local level.
But there are warning signs for Labour too. In Oldham, Labour lost control of the council. In areas with substantial numbers of Muslim voters, it's shed support, losing wards. And elsewhere, the Greens have been picking up votes, often at Labour's expense.
Voters are really, really sick of this Conservative government and the way they've run this country into the ground over the last 14 years, but they're not really feeling inspired by what Keir Starmer's Labour Party is offering.
In Stockport, where they processed the votes in a car park, Liberal Democrats won a couple of wards from Labour, modest advances. But the battlegrounds they care about most are yet to start tallying.
We're expecting to see gains, we're expecting to see good progress, but specifically in the areas where we hope to win parliamentary seats.
And I do hereby declare that Carol Ann Shevlin-Ney is duly elected.
So the picture emerging is one of Labour chalking up gains, Conservatives slipping back, and smaller parties winning support from both of them. Damien Grammaticus, BBC News.
Right, we're going to take a close look at some of the results now. With all the numbers at his fingertips, our correspondent Nick Eardley is standing by. Hi, Nick.
Hi, Lewis. Yeah, they say politics is a numbers game, and the numbers we've had overnight give us a pretty good indication of where things are at. Remember that there's a lot of counting to be done today, some tomorrow as well. So this isn't the full picture, but let me tell you where we are as of 10 o'clock. 35 of 107 councils have been counted, and you can see the picture emerging. It's a good night for Labour. They're up 52 seats from the councils counted so far. It's a bad night for the Conservatives. You can see there they've lost 122 councillors, and that's towards the upper end of their predictions. It's a bad night by what they were looking at. Pretty good for the Lib Dems, pretty good for the Greens as well. And I'll come back and talk in a minute about independents, because they're an interesting part of the big picture. This is what it means in terms of councils. Labour are up 3, the Conservatives are down 3. But this is the graphic that people in the parties will be paying a lot of attention to when they try and figure out what this means for a general election. Look at that. The Conservative vote is down 14%. That is pretty significant. Labour up 5%. They're pretty happy about where that is in particular. They think it shows they're winning in the parts of the country they need to win a general election. These are some of the results that we've picked out as interesting. Redditch, Labour gained from the Conservatives. Rushmore's the same. Labour have gained Hartlepool and Thurrock from no overall control. If you are a Conservative looking for a glimmer of hope, you might find it in Harlow or Fareham, where they have managed to hold on. I'm going to talk about Oldham in a minute as well, because Labour have lost control there. Really interesting why. But let's jump into some of the numbers in a bit more detail. Redditch. So this is really interesting. If you can see down the bottom here, all the blue, it's been Tory-controlled for years. It's not anymore. Labour, 21 seats. That's a comfortable majority on Redditch Council. Here's how things have changed. The Tories have lost 11 seats. Labour are up 10. This is a bellwether seat. It's one of those areas that the parties look to because they think it's indicative of what's going on in the rest of the country. So Labour are delighted at that result. Let's have a look at Hartlepool. We've picked this out because you might remember 3 years ago, the by-election in Hartlepool, probably the lowest moment of Keir Starmer's leadership when Labour lost to the Conservatives. They seem to be on their way back in Hartlepool. Look at that, 24 seats now to the Conservative 6. gives Labour a comfortable majority in Hartlepool. And look at the numbers again. Tories have lost 6 seats, Independents have lost 2, Labour are up 8. So is it all good news for Labour, bad news for the Conservatives? Well, on the Labour side, there's maybe a caveat in some parts of the country. It's a small caveat, but a caveat nevertheless. Have a look at Oldham in Greater Manchester. Labour have controlled this, as you can see from all the red down the bottom, for years, and they don't anymore. And in pink, you can see why. The Independents, they have won a number of seats from Labour. Labour are down 5, Independents are up 7. That 5 has gone directly from there to there. It's 5 people who criticise Labour's policy on Gaza and 1 seat directly from Labour. So that will cause a bit of concern, I think, in certain parts of the Labour Party that the Gaza war is having an impact in some parts of the country.
And Nick, let's look at Blackpool South, if we can, for that the new MP there for Labour.
Chris Webb. As you can see, this was a Conservative seat at the 2019 general election, I should say, is Labour now. By some margin, a 6,700 majority. You can see there as well, the Conservatives have only just held on to second place. That's a really big deal that Reform, the successor to Nigel Farage's Brexit party, came pretty close to finishing second. Here's how things have changed. Look at that. The Conservative vote's down by a third. That's huge. Labour's vote is up 21%. You can see there Reform up 11%. But I think this next one is the graphic of the day. Look at that swing. 26% from the Conservatives to Labour. That's huge. It's the third biggest swing since the Second World War. What's interesting is all those historic swings, those really high swings, have come in recent by-elections. This is another one. If you're a Tory MP waking up this morning thinking, what does this mean for a general election? That will make you really worried.
It's good to have a graphic of the day. Nick, thank you very much. Great stuff. And we are going to head to Blackpool because very, very quickly this morning, obviously, as you'd expect, Labour leader Sir Keir Starmer headed to Blackpool and spoke to our political correspondent there, Helen Catt.
Look, we want that general election and we're confident going into that general election because what this by-election shows is that the country wants change. This is a very clear divide now. We've had 14 years of failure and decline. We've just got chaos and division from the Tories. People want to turn the page on that and go forward with Labour and our positive plan for the country.
It's not a direct yes. Why so cautious when you've had such a big win this morning?
We want a general election. We want to win that general election. We want to take our country forward. And I thank every single person who voted Labour yesterday and put their trust in a changed Labour Party. But, you know, politics and by-elections are about messages. And obviously there's a lot of discussion now. What does this mean? I think it's really straightforward. People have had enough. They want to turn the page. They want to go forward with Labour. They know we've got a positive case. And I think now, you know, that's a direct message to the Prime Minister. The most direct of all these results that we're coming, and many are in, more to come. But this was a direct message to the Prime Minister, which is, you know, make way, let's have a general election. Let's allow our country now to go forward.
And just quickly before you let you move on to some other people, how concerned are you about the impact your Gaza position is having on your vote in some areas of the country?
Well, obviously, you know, I'm concerned wherever we lose votes, and we intend to win any votes we've lost back. But there's no denying that across the country, you know, whether it's Hartlepool in the north or Rushmore in the south or Redditch with Bellwether seat, we are winning votes across the country. And that, I think, reflects a changed Labour Party with a positive case to take to the country. So I'm very pleased with the results. Blackpool is an incredible result, but we're picking up seats where we need them in other parts of the country as well.
That was Keir Starmer there. We're going to cross live to Blackpool now. Our reporter, Rowan Bridge, is there. Hi, Rowan. So just talk us through the events of the night there.
Well, I mean, I think it became clear pretty early on last night that Labour were going to take Blackpool South. I don't think even the Labour Party, though, would have expected quite the size of the swing that they saw from the Conservatives to Labour. As Nick said, 26%, the third biggest swing in a by-election since the Second World War, and Labour clearly cock a hoop at that result. wanting to focus on it. And there's a reason Angela Rayner and Keir Starmer were here at 9 o'clock this morning, absolutely wanting to capitalise on the result here this evening. I think the other thing, though, that will worry the Conservatives is where their vote went. So 2/3 or so of those voters went to Labour, but around 1/3 of them also went to Reform UK, what was the Brexit Party. In fact, the Brexit Party almost forced the Conservatives into third place. The Conservatives only held on by about 100 votes or so, and that would have been a particular humiliation for them. The Conservatives are sort of trying to downplay all of this. They're saying that it was always going to be a difficult night for them. There were particular local circumstances. The Conservative MP was suspended, Scott Benton, and then resigned forcing this by-election, had been caught up in a lobbying scandal, and clearly that didn't help the Conservatives' prospects here, but clearly a very significant win for Keir Starmer and something that's clearly buoyed his mood this morning.
Indeed, and we heard a little bit of his speech, a little bit of his interview with Helen Catt as well. What were the kind of messages that he wanted to portray there?
Yeah, I mean, clearly you could see he was feeling very confident and buoyed by what had happened and was calling for a general election now, as you might expect from a party leader who's looking like they're 20 points or so ahead in the national polls. But I think it was also interesting when Helen Catt asked him directly, you know, are you going to win a general election? He didn't give her a straight answer. And I think it's because Keir Starmer still has that element of caution about himself, that he doesn't want to appear overly confident. He doesn't want the Labour Party to get over their skis on this, that they still, you know, he still wants the Labour Party to fight as if it's, you know, in second place, that it's the underdog, because I think the Labour Party remember what happened in 1992 when there was a sense that the Labour Party thought they were going to win and then didn't. And I think Keir Starmer doesn't want another 1992. He wants a 1997, which is incidentally when Labour took Blackpool South and then held it for 20 years.
Interesting. Rowan, thank you very much for that. We'll be back with you a little later. I want to stick with what happened in Blackpool South. We're going to speak to Richard Tice, leader of Reform UK. Thanks very much for coming on the programme.
Very good morning to you. Yes, indeed, it was an extraordinary night in Blackpool South. We got within a whisker of 100 and so votes of defeating the Tories into second place. This was our best by-election by a significant margin, way above our national polling average, which knocks into a cocked hat those sort of naysayers who said we couldn't do it. And also elsewhere in the north, in Sunderland, we beat the Tories in 16 out of 25 wards. So what's rapidly becoming clear...
I promise we will come back to the councils in a minute. Just want to stick with Blackpool South first, and then we will come on to the results elsewhere. You did certainly very well considering previous performances. How frustrated, though, from your point of view, that you didn't beat the Conservatives into second?
Yeah, look, it would have been great, of course, but nevertheless, we're delighted with 17%. It's above our national polling average. It's our best by-election result. And what it shows actually, with great local candidates, more and more people are hearing about reform and they like the message that they hear. And of course, everybody knew that Labour was going to win this. But if you look at the collapse in the Tory vote there, they went from 50% down to 17%. I mean, this is seismic shift.
But for voters, what about the idea for voters that actually you did very well, given national vote share and all the things that you just mentioned there? No one will dispute that. But it's still nowhere near actually winning a seat. So what does that say to voters in any
I tell you what that says. That says that we've got the wrong electoral system in this country, because it's patently unfair. If you're getting 17% of the votes across the country, but because of our system you can't get any seats, then that actually shows that democracy is not working. That's why most Western nations have some form of proportional representation. Here's the great irony now. The Tories are collapsing so fast, very soon they'll be begging to have proportional representation to stop a complete annihilation of the Tory party. Wouldn't that be a thing?
OK, interesting. Electoral reform has been high on the agenda of parties like the Liberal Democrats for a long time. No such shift in the offing. Let's talk about, away from Blackpool South then, the rest of the evening. What's your assessment of Reform UK's performance?
Well, the first council results that were out were actually in Sunderland in the northeast. And as I say, we beat the Tories in 16 of 25 wards, again, significantly outperforming our national polling share. And we're delighted we've got some very important mayoral results being counted over the next day and a half. And again, in the North East and in Manchester, I think we could surprise people on the upside. What's rapidly becoming clear is basically, as more people hear us about reform, we're becoming the real opposition to the Labour Party in the North, in the Midlands, in Wales. We're on the way up, and it's quite clear that the Tories are on the way down.
Well, if you say you're becoming the real opposition to the Labour Party in some areas, isn't the electoral truth that if people vote reform, they take votes away from the Conservatives and they get Labour? So vote reform, get Labour.
The more people who vote reform, then the more reform we've got the opportunity to get. Look, there's no difference between the main two parties. They're variants of socialism. The highest taxes for 70 years, the highest government spending for 70 years, the worst public sector outcomes, the lowest growth per decade for 70 years, and the longest per person recession we're currently in. It's 2 years long. That's the longest per person recession for 70 years. This is an economic catastrophe, and Labour Party's plans will not achieve any economic growth whatsoever. We hear nothing on that. We've got a bold plan to make work pay. We've got an ambitious plan to get to zero waiting lists on healthcare, which is absolutely essential. So there's so many areas of British life that, frankly, need fundamental reform, and that's what we stand for.
You said the word was getting out about Reform UK, that more people were hearing about you. If that is your ambition, Nigel Farage is pretty well known across the UK. You want him to stand, don't you?
Well, I very much have said that the more help Nigel feels able to give, the better. He's got a big decision to make. And obviously the clock is ticking because who knows, the general election, it might be a summer election. Most people think it'll be autumn, but there are a number of circumstances why it could be this summer. So, yeah, the more help Nigel feels able to give, then the better. But obviously he thought he'd left frontline politics. We trusted the Tories in 2019 to get Brexit done properly. They've messed up. They've had their chance. They've blown it. And frankly, that's why we're saying we've now got to become the real opposition to Labour's socialism.
Well, we know an election is coming at the end of this year. Wouldn't it be really helpful of Nigel to have come out, from your point of view, before these local elections, giving you a profile boost before these elections?
There are certain contractual regulations with regard to his existing broadcasting contract and things that that are important as well. And as I say, he's got a decision to make, and the clock is ticking. So, but the more help that we can get, the better. As you quite rightly say, he's probably the best known politician alongside Boris Johnson, and he's highly respected. So let's wait and see.
OK, just lastly, you weren't standing obviously in every seat, far from it, at these elections. What are you aiming for when it comes to general election?
We'll be standing in 630 seats, and that's why we've been focusing on making sure we've got candidates in every seat across England, Scotland and Wales, and that we boost that profile. But where we are standing in, I think, the 12 or 13% of council seats, we are achieving at or above our national polling average, and that is a sign of real significant progress. OK, Richard Tice, leader of Reform UK, thank you very much for coming on the programme. Thank you. Right, let's cross to Westminster. Our political correspondent, Ben Wright, is there for us. Hi, Ben. Can we just take a bit of a pause, a step back, the bigger picture here? Where are we?
Well, the bigger picture is emerging slowly, Lewis. And we've only had, I think it's about a tenth of councils actually declared their results yet. So these are all provisional observations that we're making at this stage of the weekend. Friday, Saturday, Sunday, we'll still be getting results through the weekend. And that's what the Tory chairman, Richard Holden, was saying on the airwaves this morning. He said, just wait for the weekend to unfold before making any, big overall observations. But it's clearly a very bad set of results for the Conservative Party. They thought it was going to be bad. It looks like it is. And they've lost control of important councils. Labour have now taken over in places like Hartlepool, up in the northeast, in Thurrock down in the southeast, in Rushmore, in Hampshire. These are bad results for the Conservative Party. They're very good results for Sir Keir Starmer, and they're results that seem to show that the opinion polls are broadly correct. It's being proved that this is the state of play with actual votes in ballot boxes. So, it is bleak for the Tory party at the moment. But as I said, we've got big mayoral results coming, more big councils to declare during the course of today. But so far, the mood in Tory HQ will be very despondent.
And what does that mean in what you're hearing, speaking to sources there in Westminster? What does that mean so far for Rishi Sunak, Prime Minister's position?
That was always one of the big questions going into these elections. This had been in the diary as a very potentially perilous moment for Rishi Sunak. We know that his Tory MPs are restive, they are despondent, they are glum. They know the hole that they are in. The question has been for quite a few weeks, will they, after these elections, make some sort of move against the Prime Minister, try and turf him out of his seat and install somebody else that Conservative MPs hope might have a better shot at rescuing them come the general election in a few months' time. Now, there have only been, I think, 2 Tory MPs who've publicly said they've put confidence letters in to the 1922 committee calling for a leadership contest. I'm not sure that even if these results are as bad as the Tory party thinks they're going to be, that enough Tory MPs feel a sensible thing to do would be to try and uncork another rebellion against the sitting Tory leader and Prime Minister this close to a general election. Now, the mood might change over the weekend and into next week, and we will be watching very carefully, phoning and speaking to Tory MPs off and on the record about what they think. But I think it would take quite a lot, I think, for enough Tory MPs to think that electoral salvation might lie in the upheaval of another leadership contest to try and save their party's position, because I think they feel that it could just look completely absurd after Boris Johnson, after Liz Truss, having Rishi Sunak, and then trying to roll the dice again to find another leader who may save them from potential electoral catastrophe at the general election. I think it could just look ridiculous to a lot of voters, and I think that's the prevailing mood among most Tory MPs.
OK, let's look at the more immediate future. What are we expecting this afternoon and into tomorrow in terms of results?
So we've got a very busy 48 hours, as I said, coming up. Lots of councils will be declaring during the course of late morning into the afternoon. I think the next big thing to watch out for is the result of the Tees Valley mayoralty contest, where the Conservative incumbent, Ben Houchen, is seeking re-election. In 2021, he won on a vast share of the vote. I think he got about 72%. He's a big character. He's hoping that he can win. I think the Tory party has been in the last couple of weeks relatively confident that he could hold on. There is not a Reform candidate standing in Tees Valley, so there isn't that threat from the right that might depress the Conservative vote. We shall see. I think it's around lunchtime we'll get the result in Tees Valley, and I think that's one of the really big ones that will determine how these elections are seen in the round for Rishi Sunak and the Tory party. The other big mayoral contest, of course, that has that impact, could have that impact, is Andy Street's re-election bid in the West Midlands. But we're not going to get that result until tomorrow.
Ben, great stuff. Thank you. We'll be back in Westminster a little later. Now, though, we're going to do a quick roundup of the political reaction to the results we have had so far. Chair of the Conservatives, Richard Holden, told us a little earlier results have been disappointing.
My heart goes out to a lot of my Conservative colleagues who I've been campaigning with out across the country, who've lost their seats overnight. And although we've only seen around a third of councils, a couple of the PCCs and none of the big mayoral contests yet, obviously some disappointing results so far. But also, some areas like Fareham and Harlow where we've managed to hold Conservative councils, and up in Newcastle on Tyne where we've finally got a Conservative councillor on there for the first time in 32 years. But no, overall, a disappointing night for us.
And here's the Conservative MP, Dame Andrea Jenkins.
I think the last 24 hours, I think for Rishi, he's got a message, he's been told by the electorate, wake up, be Conservative or we lose. I think that is the actual message that's come through. I mean, the by-election result, yes, we've been doing disastrous in by-elections, but I think what that's demonstrated is that, Reform can't muster enough votes to win seats, but they can hand seats to Labour.
And the co-leader of the Green Party, Carla Denyer, is standing in the next general election, and she says tonight's local election results are good for her.
Although the previous constituency of Bristol West was already a promising one for the Greens, it's even more so with the boundary changes. We think those changes roughly halve the Labour majority on their own. not accounting for the fact that voters' opinions, the leadership of the Labour Party has changed, a number of other factors locally and nationally. And simply my experience speaking to voters on the doorstep, voters are really, really sick of this Conservative government and the way they've run this country into the ground over the last 14 years, but they're not really feeling inspired by what Keir Starmer's Labour Party is offering, and they're really excited at the opportunity to vote and elect the city's first Green MP.
Right, we're going to get a bit more reaction now to the results, but we're going to dig into the numbers. Our political correspondent, Nick Eardley, is in the newsroom. Hi, Nick. So it's been a good story for Labour, but not a straightforward one. There is a bit of nuance. Talk us through that.
Yeah, I think it's quite important to remember that, Lewis. Bad night for the Conservatives. They're not doing as well as some would have hoped. In fact, it's proving worse than some feared. Labour are doing well, but there is, I think, one particularly important caveat that we need to bear in mind, and that is what's happening as a result of the conflict in Gaza. We know that Labour has been criticised over its policy about how long it took to call for a ceasefire, and that does seem to be having a bit of an impact on their vote in some parts of the country. Let me show you this. We've looked at some council wards that have a high Muslim population. A caveat to this, by the way, it's only 7 of 58 of those key wards that we flagged up which have come in so far. But look at that. The Labour vote is down in these areas that have come in so far, 16%. And look who seems to be making up the numbers. The Greens are up 19%. The Conservative vote is down as well, but remember it's down across the results we've had so far. Labour's vote overall is up, but it's down in these areas. In fact, let me show you that in a bit more detail, because this is the broad picture. So we start over here. This is the picture across the country. The vote changed since 2021. Conservatives down 14%, Labour up 5%, other parties up about 2 or 3. Then we focus in on these areas with a high Muslim population, and it's very different indeed. The Conservatives down 11%, Labour down 16%, the Greens up. So if you're in Labour HQ and you're trying to figure out this lunchtime what impact the war in Gaza has had, I think these numbers will give you a bit cause for concern. There's one result which might illustrate this, which I think we can look at in a bit more detail. Oldham in Greater Manchester. This has been Labour for years. Look down the bottom there. All that red shows that the council was controlled by the Labour Party. Not anymore. Look at that. Labour are on 27. They're still by far the biggest party, but they came short of a majority of the 31 seats they need. And this is why. It's the increase in the number of independents. Look at that. Labour have lost 5 seats. The independents have added on 7. Now, 5 of them stood on a specific platform that was criticising Labour and criticising the war in Gaza. So it does seem to be tangible evidence that in certain parts of the country, like Oldham in Greater Manchester, the Labour vote is taking a hit because of its policy on the war in Gaza.
Nick, fascinating. Thank you very much for that. Let's get reaction to those numbers. We can speak to Ali Milani, chair of Labour's Muslim Network. Thanks for coming on the programme.
Thank you very much for having me.
What do you make of those numbers?
Well, to be honest, it's something I and many others have been warning about for a very, very long time. It's clear that the pain and the hurt and the feeling of betrayal within the Muslim community is large and has been felt deeply. And we're now seeing the electoral consequence of that. We've been warning that in Muslim population areas and wards and councils and constituencies of high Muslim population areas, our positioning in Gaza is going to have a serious electoral consequence. And we're seeing that unfold across the country now.
And we're seeing it here, clearly local elections, only a few results in. We don't want to exaggerate anything here. But what potential impact do you think it could have when it comes to a general election?
Well, I will say this, Lewis. If I was a Labour MP in Bradford or Birmingham or Leicester or parts of London, Manchester, I would be seriously concerned, because while Labour are having a fairly good night, which we're pleased with across the country, in areas like Oldham, like Bolton, like even Elswick in Newcastle, where there's 32% Muslim population, and we've seen a decline in Labour's vote, circa 20%. If I'm an MP in some of these high Muslim population areas, I'm seriously concerned because it's clear that the position on Gaza, the time it took to call for a ceasefire, to this day, the refusal to go with our allies in calling for an arms embargo to stop the killing of people, innocent people in Gaza, is having an electoral consequence. So if I'm a Labour MP sat in those seats, I'm getting very, very nervous.
OK, you're nervous if you're a potential prospective Labour MP at the next general election in those areas. What's your message to Keir Starmer this morning?
Look, our message is that we have heard Sir Keir Starmer say that the Labour Party is a changed Labour Party, and we are desperate to see a Labour government. But that changed Labour Party cannot leave Muslim populations in the rearview mirror. We have to bear in mind Muslims historically have been amongst the most loyal supporters of the Labour Party. And we cannot now dismantle what has been decades and decades long relationship between Muslim populations and the Labour Party. My call to Sir Keir Starmer is please, please, this is the last warning. This is the last time we go to the polls before a general election. We have so much work to do with regaining the trust of Muslim voters, and that begins by calling for an immediate arms embargo of Israel and making sure that Muslims feel like our voice and our lives matter equally to those of others.
OK, I heard that in the broad point. The specific of arms embargo, I heard that. Is that it? What else practically do you want Keir Starmer to do?
Look, the principle is, and the reality is on the ground, and it pains me to say this, it really does. The reality is Muslim populations on the ground right now are telling us that they feel like their lives are not valued equally to that of others. We've seen the difference in policy between Ukraine and Gaza, for example. We've seen the rise of Islamophobia in this country. We've seen the economic consequences of racism towards Muslims. Muslim women are amongst the most economically disadvantaged in the country. What we have to do is both in policy and in rhetoric send a very clear message to Muslims in this country that we not only value their votes, but we value our lives as equal to others. That message is not getting through, and we have to redouble our efforts to make sure that that's done. That trust is going to take a while to win back.
I'm sure Keir Starmer would say that their lives are valued equally. The party did shift and called for a ceasefire.
Yes, but look, it took so long to do that. And some of the comments from the front bench, for example, have been so damaging. We now need to be seen as leaders in the world in trying to end this conflict, in trying to bring about a two-state solution and to make sure that no more innocent lives are lost. And the way that we do that right now is an immediate arms embargo. Our allies are already calling for this. There are many allies across the world that are already calling for an end to the killing. Our complicity in what is now over 35,000 people, nearly half of whom are children, having been killed in Gaza, it needs to end. And that ends with an immediate arms embargo. And in terms of winning back votes amongst Muslim populations, that is the clearest message we can send, that we've moved on, that we've learnt the lessons, and we're seriously invested in winning back trust of Muslim communities.
Ali Malani, thank you very much for coming on the programme. Thank you.
Thank you.
Right, we're going to take a look at the performance of the Conservatives now. I'm joined by Dominic Grieve, former Attorney General for England and Wales under David Cameron. He stood as an independent MP at the 2019 election after his Conservative whip was removed. Thank you for coming on the programme.
Good morning.
So a bad night for the Conservatives. How bad in your analysis?
Pretty bad. I think it's terribly easy to get carried away. It reinforces the picture that has been clear now for some considerable period of time, that the Conservative Party has lost contact with its electorate, is forfeiting support in a whole variety of directions, and its electoral prospects for the coming general election are, I think, completely dire. You look at the result from Blackpool South, the fact that not only was the seat lost, but that struggled to come as second place in front of Reform in a very socially disadvantaged seat. So that's one example. And then you can look around the rest of the country to places like Rushmore, where they're losing seats. Seats are being lost in areas that are traditionally pretty conservative. Now, the pattern's mixed, as in all local elections, and that's why I think one's got to be a bit careful not to get carried away. But it's a picture of a political party which is already at local government level at a pretty low base, continuing to hemorrhage support.
So what would you do if you were senior Conservative Party leadership right now?
Well, I'm not sure there's very much that can be done, because when you get yourself into this kind of rut, getting out of it, short of going out of government and resetting afterwards, is very hard. And history shows that for all political parties. And the reality is that the Conservative Party has failed to deliver in government. It delivered Brexit, which it adopted, even though there were quite a few of us who were against it, and therefore is saddled with the responsibility for its failure, because it is failing. It has delivered absolutely nothing in terms of benefits and has delivered a great many problems. And it has failed more generally because the leadership of Boris Johnson was catastrophic, as was that of Liz Truss, and resetting the party's reputation for good government, which has always historically been one of its big sells. We are a reputable group of people who even if we make mistakes, we are doing our best in the public interest. That image at the moment is lost. And I feel very sorry for the Prime Minister, because he's not personally responsible for that, although it's right to say that he has not been able to arrest the slide which he had already inherited.
And what about the argument that he should go now?
I think that would be completely crazy, because it'll just reinforce in the public mind that this is the parliamentarians are a group of irresponsible idiots. What possible good is getting rid of the Prime Minister now going to do in the 6 months before a general election? To replace him with somebody else who is going to face exactly the same problems and who, on the evidence, will have no better solutions to them. So I don't think that's a solution at all. On the contrary, the risk is then that, in fact, the hemorrhage will get even greater, particularly if the new leader represents a lurch further to the right in the party. And this has been a pattern which has been around now for some time.
I don't want to put words in your mouth. You don't seem overly optimistic. Playing not devil's advocate, but the other way, what reason for optimism could you draw from any of this for the Conservatives?
There are some signs of optimism. Before we talk of a complete wipeout, Conservative councillors are holding seats. Conservatives in local government are capable of delivering in well-run authorities, very good local government. It is possible that tomorrow we will discover that in Birmingham and Teesside, the mayors who are standing again for re-election have bucked the trend, because they have actually come across as pragmatic, reasonable, sensible, and people with common sense. And if that's the case, that will be a step back in the right direction. And I might add, an indication of what is needed if the party is to restore its fortunes. My concern is that the party will lose the next general election very badly, and then will, at least in the short to medium term, go off on a complete fantasy run, further and further towards the populist right, and will discover in doing this that, in fact, far from building support, they will lose more and more support from the centre ground, which is the only place where you can win elections in UK politics.
Dominic Grieve, as always, thank you very much for coming on the programme. Fascinating thoughts there from Mr. Grieve. Right, let's look at a different story, the Tees Valley mayoral election. We can speak to Richard Moss, political editor at North East and Cumbria, who is live for us now. Good to see you. Just give us the lay of the land there.
Yeah, well, counting began here about 9:30. I'm told it's progressing pretty fast. We were given an original declaration estimate about 12:30, but maybe sooner than that. They are counting in various different areas, but this is where the result will be declared. And obviously, Ben Houchin, who won with 73% of the vote in 2021, is not expecting such a resounding result this time. He just wants to win. He says by one vote is enough. His Labour rival, Chris McEwen, they would love to beat Ben Houchin. He's the kind of poster boy for levelling up. It would be a huge blow to the Prime Minister, Rishi Sunak, to lose a mayor as high profile as this. It has to be said that Labour have been downplaying expectations of winning here. They like to just push it as close as possible. For Ben Houchin, obviously it would be a triumph to win a third term when Conservatives in this region are pretty unpopular at the moment. But whether it's much solace to the Conservatives or whether this is a very personal vote, hard to tell. He certainly has made it quite clear to voters in Tees Valley that this is about choosing who's the best person to lead this area and nothing sure about Westminster politics. We'll see what the result is in hopefully about an hour and a half, couple of hours' time.
OK, thank you very much for that. We'll be back there a little later on. Now we're going to speak to Henry Hill, acting editor of the Conservative Home website. Thanks for coming on the programme.
Good morning.
So what's your mood right now?
Tired. This is the last stop in what I think has been an 11-hour media round. But from the party's perspective, they really are waiting on the fillip from those mayoral results, because the council elections that we've had so far, with the exception of a few bright spots like Harlow, have been really, really terrible for the government. They've lost hundreds of councillors. They've had a historically bad ratio of seats successfully defended, seats contested. And all of those councillors that they've lost are infantry that they're going to have to do without at the general election, because these days, when party membership is down and activism is less a part of day-to-day life, local councillors and the family and friends they can cajole out to join them are vital parts of every party's ground machine.
That's really interesting. I haven't heard too much of that, the actual practical implications, not just the straight maths and arithmetic of losing people, but I suppose the local infrastructure and the local influence too. What about some of the potential counter-arguments? It's still early days. We don't have a lot of results yet in these kind of elections. Governing party tends to do pretty badly. Any of those kind of arguments swaying you?
So the governing parties can do badly, although of course another argument the Conservative ministers are making is that we're measuring from 2021 when the Conservatives as a governing party did very well. So there are obviously limits to that. Yeah, I mean there are always turnouts down, for example, in local elections compared to a general election, and you can imagine that there are quite a lot of undermotivated Tory voters who, the residual core Tory vote, who will turn out to vote for them in a general election. But those are really cold comfort when you're losing by this margin. There really is nothing to suggest that these elections do not presage a really serious defeat at the general election. I think that the interesting thing is, because we haven't had all the results at once, because we've moved, especially for local elections over the past couple of decades, towards counting over the weekend, the order in which we get the results really matters. So there is an argument that maybe actually the Tory narrative of this weekend is going to end on a high note, because one, they're getting the mayoral elections, and the expectation, I think, is that Ben Houchen will hold on. And the word I'm hearing on very limited intelligence from some pollsters is that Andy Street might hold on in the West Midlands, which would be a major fillip for the Conservatives. But also those really, really bad council election results they had at the beginning of the night, that was when we were seeing far more Reform candidates. Now, Reform UK have actually only stood in about 1 in 8 seats overall in this set of elections. But a lot of those seats were last night, and they do seem to have had a really appreciable share on Tory results, because even when the Tory vote isn't down spectacularly, or their vote share, they are losing more seats. So it might be that actually the results do improve. But just because that narrative arc over the weekend ends on a higher note, and we, the media, are as bad at falling for this as anyone, doesn't take away from the headline fact that those results are terrible.
And just because you brought in Reform UK there, what do you think the potential impact they could have on any general election when it comes to the Conservative Party?
Well, the big question for CCHQ now is Reform UK better or worse in by-elections than in general elections? Normally, a challenger party like the Liberal Democrats or the Greens, they do better in by-elections because they've got lots of activists, but they're often spread around the country. And in a by-election, they can put them all in one place and it levels the playing field. Reform UK has very few activists, and it doesn't even have members. It's not a membership organisation. So it really does rely on the national brand, the air in the lingo. So there's actually a counter thesis to the normal by-election thesis, which is that actually Reform UK will do better when the major parties' resources are spread all over the country, and it can just maximise the impact of its air war and its brand. So that result, where they almost came in second in Blackpool South last night, the nightmare scenario for CCHQ is that they're actually capable of posting vote shares like that in a lot of places in a general election where the Conservatives will not be able to throw all of their resources at one seat.
Interesting. And I have to ask about Rishi Sunak, because questions are always asked. So far, the commentators that we've had on in the last half an hour haven't been convinced by any argument for replacing him. What's your thought?
Conservative Home, we run our regular monthly survey of Conservative Party members. We published a result on this very question this morning, which you can find on our website. 6 in 10, almost 2/3 of Conservative Party members that we surveyed do not want Rishi Sunak to step down. They don't think that the by-elections, the local elections, however bad, should be the trigger for that, because ultimately, when we asked them last month, they think that trying to change the leader now, going through that drawn-out process of a challenge, and then multiple rounds of MPs, and then that hugely damaging kind of final stage that we saw in 2022. They think doing that this close to an election without a clear contender or challenger, because most of them want to wait until after the general election to try and take over, is just a recipe for disaster. So I think I stand, and Conservative Party members that we've spoken to stand with the other people who've been on your show. Whether or not individual Tory MPs support Rishi Sunak, we are now simply too close to the general election for trying to change leader in a fit of panic to be a good idea.
Henry Hill, hope you get a bit of a break. Thank you very much for coming on the programme. Appreciate it. Now we're going to have a look at the implications for some of the numbers we've been looking at. So John Curtice is Professor of Politics at the University of Strathclyde. I spoke to him just a little earlier.
There are two principal messages that are coming out of these local election results, together with the parliamentary by-election in Blackpool. The first is that so far as the gap between Conservative and Labour is concerned, nothing very much seems to have changed. In one sense, that sounds like a surprising statement, because the swing from Conservative to Labour in Blackpool South at just over 26% is the third biggest swing in post-war electoral history. Trouble is, swings of that kind of size have now become rather commonplace in the last year or so. We've actually had 5 by-elections in which the swing from Conservative to Labour has been over 20%. So that in that sense, it's more of the same. It's a set of parliamentary by-elections of the kind that we have really not seen since the 92 to 97 Parliament, which of course ended in defeat for the Conservatives. Equally, if we look at the detailed voting figures that the BBC has been collecting overnight, and there's many of them more yet still to come. But so far, at least, it looks as though, if anything, support for the Conservatives in these local elections is a wee bit down on last year. Support for the Labour Party certainly holding firm, maybe very slightly higher. Anyway, either way, there's no evidence here of any closing of the gap that between Labour and the Conservatives, any narrowing of the Labour lead. So again, we've got more of the same, just indeed as the opinion polls have been suggesting. The one difference, but again it's anticipated by the opinion polls, is that Reform UK were performing more strongly than they did last year, though they still didn't fight that many of the wards. But crucially for the Conservatives, their intervention in Blackpool South almost created the embarrassment of getting the Conservatives ending up in 3rd place. And in local council elections, places like Sunderland, for example, where again Reform did particularly well, you discover that it's the Conservative Party in particular that seems to suffer. And that again has been a message of opinion polls, but it's really a development of only the last 3, 4, 5 months ago. So it does basically mean the Conservatives are still in as much trouble as they were a year ago, with the added twist that they now have 2 parties biting into their vote, i.e. Labour and Reform, rather than just perhaps one for the most part 12 months ago.
Interesting. And on the numbers, what will you be working on this morning and this afternoon to try and get the best possible picture to try and translate over to any general election?
Well, there are 2 things that will be going on during the course of today. The first is we will be looking at the scale of the Conservative losses. At the moment, they're losing 1 seat in 2, which means they could end up losing 500 seats, which was widely suggested before the elections. That would be a bad result. But the second big thing we'll be doing with those detailed voting figures that I've already referred to is coming up with what we call the projected national share, which is not a forecast of the general election in 6 months' time, not even a statement of what might have happened if we'd had a general election on Thursday, but rather an estimate of what would have happened if the whole country had had local elections on Thursday, because only bits of England did, and people behaved in these local elections in much the same way as those parts of the country that did have local elections. And that's something we do every year. And so you'll have to wait and see what we come up with. I'll just say to you that last year, Labour on this estimate were at 35%, the Conservatives down at 26%, and the Liberal Democrats at 20%. The Liberal Democrats always do better on this estimate and in local elections than in the national opinion polls. So that's our benchmark. We'll have to wait and see what our calculation comes up with when we've got a lot more results, shall we say, probably the second half of the afternoon.
Thanks to Professor Curtice for that. Now, a little earlier, I spoke to Wendy Chamberlain, the MP for North East Fife and the Liberal Democrats Chief Whip.
It's obviously very early days, and we're hopeful of seeing real progress in places like Tunbridge Wells, Wokingham and Dorset later on today. But if you look at it, so far all 4 councils that we were defending, we've won, including in Hull, for example, where we were facing off against Labour. We've made gains in places like Fareham in Suella Braverman's backyard. And so I think where we are looking and we're expecting to make progress, that's exactly what we've done.
And what do you think this will translate to in a general election? Is there enough momentum there?
Well, as you will be aware, there was 80 seats that we were second to the Conservatives with in 2019, and we're very clear about the work we are doing to ensure that we bring as many Liberal Democrat MPs to Parliament as possible. And when you look again at the results overnight in places like Eastleigh, in Cheadle, in Hazel Grove, we have won the popular vote in those constituencies. So that demonstrates to me that we are making the right progress as we look to the general election, which frankly can't come soon enough.
The reputation of the Liberal Democrats, as you know, is they overperform in local elections, elections in between general elections effectively, and then underperform during the general election. So if you're pointing to the positives there, are you clear that you've dispelled that stereotype of the Liberal Democrats?
I think we've made, this is going to be looking like the local elections where for the 6th time in a row, the Liberal Democrats have made progress, and we've never done that as a party. We've also won over 650 councillors in this term of Parliament, which is more than any other party. So I really think that we are making huge progress, and it's quite clear when you look at the 4 by-election wins that we have had in this Parliament, that where we focus our resources, we do well, particularly given that the Conservatives are in freefall.
Do you want a general election sooner rather than later?
Absolutely. It's quite clear that there is a very strong and consistent message that the voters are giving to the Conservatives. What else can they do in the time left remaining to them? Rishi Sunak should accept that now is the time for a general election.
When you were listening, I'm sure you would have heard Sir Keir Starmer there up in Blackpool South talking about that messaging towards Rishi Sunak. It's stale, time for a change, get out the way, country move forward under Labour. Is that messaging pretty similar to your messaging, and does that encourage you or worry you?
Well, I think it's quite clear that change is a narrative that is coming forward. Now, obviously, I've not had elections in North East Fife. There are no local elections in Scotland until 2027. But certainly what I'm hearing is change. And that is true not just in relation to Conservatives, but here in Scotland, it's relation to the SNP, where it looks like we are going to have a new First Minister, 3 First Ministers in the same amount of time that the Conservatives have brought forward Prime Ministers. And there's a need for change here in Scotland too.
And let's hear now from Labour's National Campaign Coordinator, Pat McFadden.
The most significant result overnight is the Blackpool South by-election, where we've won a stunning victory, a 26% swing, with the Tories barely hanging on to second place. And elsewhere in the local council elections, gains like in Hartlepool in the north, which you've just been discussing, in Rushmore in the south. So we're feeling good. We fought a good positive campaign. The results are good for us overnight so far, and of course we've got a lot more to come over the next couple of days.
Meanwhile, there was a headache for former Prime Minister Boris Johnson because he was turned away from his polling station when he went to vote because he forgot to bring photo ID. You may know photo ID is a requirement that he brought in when he was Prime Minister. It was his law. Introduced the law back in 2022, making it compulsory for voters in England to show photo ID. It's understood, though, that he did later, well, he went home or somewhere, picked up the right ID, then went back, and then was able to vote. Right, let's take you to Stockton-on-Tees now. We have our live pictures right across England right now. We are waiting for various different results. I should stress, of course, that we have had lots of results in overnight through the night, as we always do. However, we are nowhere near done. Over the last few elections, you may have noticed the trend away from knowing every single result on Friday morning when everyone wakes up, has their breakfast and heads into work. Now it can take a couple of days with different voting and vote counting schedules. So that's why we are waiting for some crucial regional mayoral results, which hold some hope for the Conservative Party. They haven't had much to shout about, haven't had a great deal to celebrate, but they will be hoping that mayoral elections go their way. We are expecting some that this afternoon, so we will wait for that. And let's go live to Blackpool. A very good night for the Labour Party there. Blackpool South by-election going the way of the Labour Party. New MP there in and celebrating and immediately calling for a general election, criticising Rishi Sunak, criticising the current Conservative government, and then very quickly the arrival, as you'd expect. To celebrate there is just at the back, coming down the steps in front of Angela Rayner, there is Sir Keir Starmer, and he gave a speech there. Again, that now refrain we're pretty used to, calling for a general election, saying that the Labour Party is the future, saying the country wants a future with Labour, and asking for Rishi Sunak, the Prime Minister, to call for a general election. But we have no sense yet of any general election date, other than Rishi Sunak's previous indications that it will be the second half of this year. Legally, it has to be before the end of January next year, but expectation still is that it will take place before the end of this year. Right, you can keep up to date, of course, with all the results on the website. For now, I'm Vaughan Jones. This is BBC News. Big Conservative losses in local elections across England, with the party potentially facing its worst night in the polls in 4 decades. Labour win the Blackpool South by-election with a 26% swing of the vote. Sir Keir Starmer hails his party's performance and had this message.
We want that general election, and we're confident going into that general election, because what this by-election shows is that the country wants change.
Lib Dems have retained all the councils they held, while it's been a strong night for the Green Party. This is a scene live in Stockton. Votes being counted in mayoral contest in Tees Valley. I'm Vaughan Jones. Welcome to the programme. Plenty of results for us to pick through, although I should say, big caveat right at the top of the show, not all the results are in yet. We may have to wait until Saturday for the full picture of what's happened. But so far, we can safely say Conservatives having a rough time. They've lost around half the council seats they were defending. That's similar to how they performed in 1995, 2 years before they were crushed at a general election. Labour, the Greens and the Liberal Democrats all made gains, and Labour are celebrating a victory in the Blackpool South by-election with a huge swing from the Conservatives. With the story of the night, here's our political correspondent, Damien Grammaticus.
Commonly known as Chris, Labour Party, 10,825.
Blackpool South, a little before 5 a.m, and a decisive Labour victory. They were confident of emerging winners in the by-election, but this was emphatic.
They have said to Rishi Sunak and to the Conservatives, they've had enough. They've had enough for 14 years of the Conservatives being in power. They have lost trust of the British people, and Blackpool has had enough of this failed government.
The Conservatives, who had held the seat, were beaten into second place, but the shock for Tories will be that Reform very nearly pushed them into third.
They didn't get Brexit done properly, they didn't cut immigration, and people are tired and sick and tired of the Tory incompetence and lies. We're done with it. We're done with the Tories. It's time for change. It's time for reform.
And the first council of the night to change control, Hartlepool.
Q&A at Bailey Fleet, Labour and Cooperative Party, 649 votes.
The Conservatives lost 6 councillors here, Labour in charge again. The win is symbolic for them, clawing back lost ground.
Day, Thomas William, Labour Party, 806.
In Rushmore in Hampshire, Labour have taken control directly from the Conservatives. Boundary changes helped here, but it's also been gaining wards from Tories. Mounting losses, an unwelcome sight for the Conservative minister at the count. And in North East Lincolnshire, more Labour cheer.
Wow.
Conservatives lost control of the council here. Grimsby is exactly the sort of place Labour will hope to win back at the general election.
Sadly, in local elections, they tend to mirror the polls at national level, and clearly it's a statement of the obvious. We're far behind in the polls nationally, and people follow through at local level.
But there are warning signs for Labour too. In Oldham, Labour lost control of the council. In areas with substantial numbers of Muslim voters, it's shed support, losing wards. And elsewhere, the Greens have been picking up votes, often at Labour's expense.
Voters are really, really sick of this Conservative government and the way they've run this country into the ground over the last 14 years, but they're not really feeling inspired by what Keir Starmer's Labour Party is offering.
In Stockport, where they processed the votes in a car park, Liberal Democrats won a couple of wards from Labour, modest advances. But the battlegrounds they care about most are yet to start tallying.
We're expecting to see gains, we're expecting to see good progress, but specifically in the areas where we hope to win parliamentary seats.
And I do hereby declare that Carol Ann Shevlin-Ney is duly elected.
So the picture emerging is one of Labour chalking up gains, Conservatives slipping back, and smaller parties winning support from both of them. Damien Grammaticus, BBC News.
Right, let's get some analysis of those results. Our man with his finger on the pulse, Nick Eardley, is in the newsroom. Nick, take it away.
Hi, Lewis. Thanks very much. Yeah, I mean, look, this is a big moment in the electoral cycle because it's the biggest sense of where we're getting the public at before the general election. So let's start off with the big picture this lunchtime. Remember that there's a long way to go, but with 35 of the 107 councils, 37 now of the 107 councils in England declared, this is the picture we have. Labour are having a good night so far. They're up 54 councillors. The Conservatives, as you can see, are having a very bad time of it so far, down 126. That will really worry them. Lib Dems are having a pretty good time. Greens as well are doing all right. And really interesting, the increase in the number of independents. I'm going to come back to that because I think there's something in that we can dive into a bit further. This is what it means in terms of the state of the parties. Labour up 3, the Conservatives down 3. This is the number that will be watched very closely in the party HQs to give us a sense of the popularity or otherwise of the main parties. Look at the Conservatives there, down 14% in the vote compared to 2021 when these seats were last contested. Labour are up 5, other parties up 2 or 3. In terms of what's been really interesting so far in the results, we've picked out a few that are worth flagging up. Redditch was Conservatives, now Labour. Same in Rushmore was Conservative, now Labour. Hartlepool and Thurrock didn't have any control. They were hung councils before last night. They're both Labour as well. All of that will hearten Keir Starmer. This in Oldham is really interesting. I'm going to explain a bit more about this in a minute. That might give Labour a bit cause for concern. And if you're a Conservative watching and you're pretty depressed about all of this, there's maybe a small glimmer of hope in Harlow and in Fareham, where on a really devastatingly bad night, the Tories may have lost control of those councils, but they've held on. So, look, let's dive a bit more into some specific examples which help us tell the story of what's happened so far. Redditch. If you look down the bottom there, it's quite small, but you might be able to pick out the blue. It's been Conservative run for years, not anymore. Look at that, 21 Labour councillors now, compared to just 5 Conservatives. That's a comfortable majority for Labour. And here's why. Here's what changed overnight. Labour up 10, the Conservatives down 11. Redditch is one of those places, Lewis, that we refer to as a bellwether. The parties look at Redditch because they think it's indicative of what's being said in the rest of the country, that it gives them a sense of the popular mood. So this result has really heartened Labour HQ. Let's have a look next at Rushmore and Hampshire. Again, one of those areas that has been Conservative for years. Look at the blue along the bottom. Not anymore. This is the percentage of votes that the parties got. Labour on 48, the Conservatives on 37. And there's the change in those percentages. Labour up 16, Conservatives down 17. That will really worry Rishi Sunak this lunchtime. It's not all good news for Labour, though, and just one trend that isn't the biggest story of the night, but is an important one, is something we saw in Oldham in Greater Manchester. Labour have controlled this for years. We've got all the red down the bottom. They don't anymore, and this is why, in pink, the number of independents has stopped Labour getting a majority. Here's what's changed. Labour lost 5 seats and the independents won 7. Those 5 seats that Labour lost, it lost to people who stood against the party's platform on Gaza, on the war in Gaza, and said, we don't agree with your policy, we would do it differently. They are 5 of those 7 independents. So if you're Labour trying to work out if your vote in certain communities might be affected by the war in Gaza, this is going to make you a bit nervous. I don't think it's the biggest problem in the world for Labour, but on a night that's broadly been a good result for the party, this will give them a bit cause for nervousness.
And Nick, there was a by-election as well, so a new MP, Blackpool South. Just run us through that.
Here we go. This is the result in Blackpool South. You might remember 3 years ago, Lewis, Labour lost a by-election in Hartlepool. There was a question then about how the party was doing in parts of the country that it had traditionally done quite well in. One of them was Blackpool South, because it was Conservative at the last general election. Well, have a look at this. Labour have won by a pretty stonking majority, actually. 7,600 votes more than the Conservatives. And the other thing that will make the Tories really worried is this number here. Mark Butcher from the Reform Party, the successor to Nigel Farage's Brexit Party, he almost beat the Conservative candidate. There's only, 117 votes in that? That is really close and will worry Conservative HQ. Here's the percentages. Labour up on nearly 60%. But here's the change. Look at that Tory vote. It's collapsed. It's down by a third. That is a really big change for the Conservative Party. Labour up 21, and as I was just mentioning, Reform there on 11%, or up 11%, and on 11%. This next slate, though, is the one that I think is probably the graphic of the night. Have a look at this. It's a huge swing from the Conservatives to Labour. 26% will really make Conservative MPs looking at these results, wondering what it might mean for them, nervous this morning. That is the third biggest swing from the Conservatives to Labour since the Second World War. It's worth just reflecting quickly, Lewis, that the other two, the swings that were bigger than this, have come in recently as well, and big by-election wins for Labour. So there'll be a lot of Tory MPs who are going over these results, trying to figure out what it means for a general election, looking at that, and they'll be worried.
Interesting, Nick. Thank you very much for that. Now, when that election result there in Blackpool South was pretty clear, it was clear what the Labour leader, Keir Starmer's plans were, and that was to get there as quick as possible, which he did this morning.
Look, we want that general election, and we're confident going into that general election, because what this by-election shows is that the country wants change. This is a very clear divide now. We've had 14 years of failure and decline. We've just got chaos and division from the Tories. People want to turn the page on that and go forward with Labour and our positive plan for the country.
It's not a direct yes. Why so cautious when you've had such a big win this morning?
We want a general election. We want to win that general election. We want to take our country forward. And I thank every single person who voted Labour yesterday and put their trust in a changed Labour Party. But, you know, politics and by-elections are about messages. And obviously there's a lot of discussion now. What does this mean? I think it's really straightforward. People have had enough. They want to turn the page. They want to go forward with Labour. They know we've got a positive case. And I think now, you know, that's a direct message to the Prime Minister. The most direct of all these results that we're coming, I mean, many are in, more to come. But this was a direct message to the Prime Minister, which is, you know, make way, let's have a general election. Let's allow our country now to go forward.
And just quickly before we let you move on to some other people, how concerned are you about the impact your Gaza position is having on your vote in some areas of the country?
Well, obviously, you know, I'm concerned wherever we lose votes, and we intend to win any votes we've lost back. But there's no denying that across the country, you know, whether it's Hartlepool in the north or Rushmore in the south or Redditch with Bellwether seat, we are winning votes across the country. And that, I think, reflects a changed Labour Party with a positive case to take to the country. So I'm very pleased with the results. Blackpool is an incredible result, but we're picking up seats where we need them in other parts of the country as well.
That was Keir Starmer in Blackpool just a couple of hours ago. Live now in Blackpool is our reporter, Rowan Bridge. So a very happy local Labour Party and a very happy national Labour Party leader there as well.
Oh, very much so. I mean, I think you could tell the confidence and buoyancy that Keir Starmer had got from this result. I mean, to be fair, it was clear pretty early on last night that Labour were going to take this seat, but I think even they must be surprised by the scale of that victory. As Nick was saying, a 26% swing from the Conservatives to Labour, one of the biggest since the Second World War. And I think the other thing that, the other party that are feeling pleased this evening or today are Reform UK, what used to be the Brexit party. Richard Tice has been out this morning saying he's delighted with their result because the Conservatives sort of found themselves caught in a pincer movement, really. Labour has stolen a chunk of their vote and a chunk of it also went to Reform UK. They almost forced the Conservatives into third place here last night. The Conservatives only holding on by just over 100 votes or so. So I think a good night for Labour. Reform UK are very happy. A very disappointing result for the Conservatives. However, they try and spin it.
And what was we heard from the new MP there. What was his message in his victory speech?
Yeah, I mean, I think the tone from Labour is that they are calling for a general election. Not surprisingly, they feel they're on a roll at the moment. They have had a consistent lead in the national polls of around 20% or so over the Conservatives, and they feel that momentum is with them, and a result like Blackpool South obviously helps with that. I think they've also been buoyed by some of the local factors here as well in Blackpool South. Scott Benton, the former MP who resigned, was caught up in a lobbying scandal, and I think that really tarnished the Conservative brand here. Also, I think it's worth noting that, you know, people like us are paying a lot of attention to this, and obviously the national parties are paying a lot of attention to the result here and what the impact of that will be. But the turnout itself was only around a third. You know, 2/3 of voters or so in Blackpool South didn't bother to turn out. So I think, you know, if you walk up and down the seafront here, for a lot of people, the result is something that they really didn't participate in and probably haven't paid as much attention to as political leaders and the media have, to be honest.
That's a good note of caution. Yeah, we should all be wary of turnout and, of course, that issue of translating local elections into national projections or predictions. Very, very strong note of caution with any of that. Thank you very much, Rowan Bridge there at Blackpool. Appreciate you talking us through the events there. That's the good news story for Labour. Well, a short while ago, I spoke to the leader of Reform UK, Richard Tice, and started by asking him if he was frustrated that Reform didn't just beat the Conservatives there in that seat.
It would have been great, of course, but nevertheless, we're delighted with 17%. It's above our national polling average. It's our best by-election result. And what it shows actually with great local candidates, more and more people are hearing about Reform and they like the message that they hear. And of course, everybody knew that Labour was going to win this. But if you look at the collapse in the Tory vote there, They went from 50% down to 17%. I mean, this is seismic shift.
But for voters, what about the idea for voters that actually you did very well, given national vote share and all the things that you just mentioned there? No one will dispute that. But it's still nowhere near actually winning a seat. So what does that say to voters in any
I tell you what that says. That says that we've got the wrong electoral system in this country, because it's patently unfair. If you're getting 17% of the votes across the country, but because of our system you can't get any seats, then that actually shows that democracy is not working. That's why most Western nations have some form of proportional representation. Here's the great irony now. The Tories are collapsing so fast, very soon they'll be begging to have proportional representation to stop a complete annihilation of the Tory party. Wouldn't that be a thing?
OK, interesting. Electoral reform has been high on the agenda of parties like the Liberal Democrats for a long time. No such shift in the offing. Let's talk about, away from Blackpool South then, the rest of the evening. What's your assessment of Reform UK's performance?
Well, the first council results that were out were actually in Sunderland in the northeast. And as I say, we beat the Tories in 16 of 25 wards, again, significantly outperforming our national polling share. And we're delighted we've got some very important mayoral results being counted over the next day and a half. And again, in the northeast and in Manchester, I think we could surprise people on the upside. What's rapidly becoming clear is basically, as more people hear us about reform, we're becoming the real opposition to the Labour Party in the north, in the Midlands, in Wales. We're on the way up, and it's quite clear that the Tories are on the way down.
Well, if you say you're becoming the real opposition to the Labour Party in some areas, isn't the electoral truth that if people vote Reform, they take votes away from the Conservatives and they get Labour? So vote Reform, get Labour.
The more people who vote Reform, then the more Reform we've got the opportunity to get. Look, there's no difference between the main two parties. They're variants of socialism. The highest taxes for 70 years, the highest government spending for 70 years, the worst public sector outcomes, the lowest growth per decade for 70 years, and the longest per person recession we're currently in. It's 2 years long. That's the longest per person recession for 70 years. This is an economic catastrophe, and the Labour Party's plans will not achieve any economic growth whatsoever. We hear nothing on that. We've got a bold plan to make work pay. We've got an ambitious plan to get to zero waiting lists on healthcare, which is absolutely essential. So there's so many areas of British life that, frankly, need fundamental reform, and that's what we stand for.
You said the word was getting out about Reform UK, that more people were hearing about you. If that is your ambition, Nigel Farage is pretty well known across the UK. You want him to stand, don't you?
Well, I very much have said that the more help Nigel feels able to give, the better. He's got a big decision to make. And obviously the clock is ticking, because who knows, the general election, it might be a summer election. Most people think it'll be autumn, but there are a number of circumstances why it could be this summer. So, yeah, the more help Nigel feels able to give, then the better. But obviously, he thought he'd left frontline politics. We trusted the Tories in 2019 to get Brexit done properly. They've messed up. They've had their chance. They've blown it. And frankly, that's why we're saying we've now got to become the real opposition to Labour's socialism.
Thanks to Richard Tice there from Reform UK. You heard him saying it was a good night for his party. It's been a good night for the other smaller parties, Liberal Democrats and the Greens. Adrian Ramsey, co-leader of the Green Party, England and Wales, joins us live from Westminster. Thanks for coming on the programme.
Good morning.
What do you make of the performance then of the Greens, above or below your expectations?
It's been above my expectations so far. We've had an excellent night and we're on track for a fifth election in a row to get a record number of Green councillors elected right across the country. And it is that national performance that's particularly encouraging for me. We've made breakthroughs, winning our first councillors in places like Newcastle, Sefton and Redditch. We've added to our councillor numbers in all corners of England, places like Exeter, Peterborough, South Tyneside. And what we've shown yet again is that right across the country, in urban areas and rural, winning seats from Labour and from the Conservatives, Greens are really now a national force, winning seats in local government in all corners of the country. And people know that if they want change and they want to vote positively for a hard-working Green who's going to represent their community for a fairer society and a greener future, they can get that by voting Green in the local elections and when it comes to the general election as well.
OK, you stretched it there to the general election, but you know full well a good performance in local elections will not translate into MPs and Westminster seats across the country, will it?
Well, what we've got the excellent foundations for now is to build our support in those parts of the country where we have the best chance of gaining Green MPs. So if you look at places like Herefordshire, like Bristol, like East Anglia, where I'm based, the seats in those places, we have a big concentration of Green councillors where we're now the main opposition to the incumbent, and people can see that if they want to change, they want to have a strong Green advocate, not just for their community, but a strong Green voice in Parliament, then we can get those Green voices there. And you know, based on the national polls, we're expecting there to be a change of government, and people clearly want there to be a change. But do we want Labour to have a huge majority and be able to do whatever it wants? Or would it be better for democracy to have more of a diversity of voices in Parliament, including Green MPs there to speak up on the biggest issues of our time, on the breakdown of our climate and nature, on growing inequality in society, on our public services being really stretched and needing the funding that Greens are willing to advocate needs to be put in? We desperately need those Green voices at a national level too.
You want those Green voices at a national level. I just spoke to Richard Tice from Reform. I don't know how much you agree with him on in general politics, but he wants electoral reform. He says his party's vote share realistically isn't going to get him the representation at Westminster that he thinks he deserves. Do you agree with him?
Well, that might be the only thing I do agree with Richard Tice on, and there's lots of things that we do need to do to restore trust and faith in our democracy, which has been shattered in recent years. And yes, a fairer voting system is one of the things I would like to see. But what I would put in front of you is the fact that Greens are now doing really well under the electoral system that we've got. And you mentioned Reform, but if you look at the BBC's own website, the total number of Reform councillors elected last night was 0, and they had about 10 leading into this election. The Green Party has 750 councillors elected across the country. Our strategy is not about shaving off a few votes here and there from another party. It's about getting Greens elected at all levels of government to be strong advocates for our community and for a fairer society. We're the ones willing to say that our NHS is at breaking point, that people can't get access to a local dentist, that bus services have been eroded, and we're willing to say that the very richest in society, the multimillionaires, the billionaires, should be asked to pay even modestly more in tax, which would enable us to raise tens of billions to invest in our public services, as well as a transition to a greener economy with all of the jobs and opportunities for bringing down people's bills that brings with it. And those changes we're only going to get by having a strong Green voice in Parliament, and that's why we're focused not on shaving off a few votes here and there, but on getting Greens elected, as we've been doing in record numbers over the last few sets of elections, and we look set for another set of record results during today.
OK. Adrian Ramsey, thank you very much for coming on the programme. Thank you very much from co-leader there of the Green Party. Right, let's go to Westminster. Ben Wright has been standing by and listening in. Ben, just give us your analysis of the state of play.
Bit of a lull at the moment, Lewis, while we wait for more councils to declare. So far, just over a third of the councils in England who've had elections have given us their results, and there'll be quite a rush as we head towards lunchtime and early afternoon. We'll start to get many more results. I mean, I think the big picture at the moment, and it's a partial one because we haven't had the majority of councils declare yet, and we haven't had mayoral results. The big picture clearly is the Tories are doing badly. I mean, we've got to remember that the sort of the comparison we're making is to how the Conservatives performed in 2021. The seats up for grabs this time, the vast majority were last contested back then when the Tories were doing very well. Boris Johnson was Prime Minister, the Tory party was doing well, but the vaccine had just been rolled out. He had a huge by-election win in Hartlepool. I remember him going up there and there was a gigantic Boris Johnson blimp over the harbour. It was a moment when Keir Starmer was contemplating resigning, and all the talk was of the Tories being in power for a decade. Today already feels a very, very, very long way away from that, and the early results seem to be mirroring what the opinion polls are saying, which is that the Tories are in a very deep electoral hole. So some of the councils we've had so far that stand out: Hartlepool, which Labour now control, Thurrock down in the southeast, Redditch, Rushmore, in Hampshire. These are good wins for the Labour Party and will be causing, I think, further despondency in Tory HQ. What the Conservatives are really hoping for is that some of those big mayoral contests, two in particular, Ben Houchen, the Conservative mayor in Tees Valley, and Andy Street, the Tory mayor in the West Midlands, they're desperately hoping that one or both of them can get re-elected. And I think if that happens, that could shift the narrative that we have at the moment quite a lot.
OK, and let's treat the elections in their own right just for a second. Just broadly underline the significance of local elections, first as democratic exercises, but also day-to-day impact on people's lives.
Yeah, I mean, councils are responsible for very large budgets. They deliver the services that people, I think, probably most experience day to day in their communities, which is why the makeup of a council does really matter to people, and we shouldn't forget that at all. I mean, that is why millions of people would have turned out to vote yesterday. It's about their local services. But inevitably, Lewis, this is seen as a snapshot of the national mood, and the electoral psephologists later on today will come up with a protected national share, an indication of what may happen in terms of the party's national support were the local election results extrapolated across the country, and we'll get that later this afternoon. And we are months away from a general election, so this has a very big bearing on the mood of all the parties at Westminster. And as I said, so far they're confirming what the polls are showing, which is that Labour are doing very well and the Conservatives badly. And one of the big questions going into these elections was whether the results could be so bad for the Tories it might uncork another panic of rebellion among the Tory party backbenchers and a potential possible move to try and replace Rishi Sunak with another leader. Now, we're nowhere near that moment right now. What will happen over the next 48 hours? We shall see.
Ben, thank you, as always. Great stuff. Right, we're going to take a moment now to look at different mayoral elections. We're going to head East Midlands first. Peter Saul, political editor for the East Midlands. Great to see you. Tell us where you are and what's happening.
Yeah, I'm here at the Nottingham Tennis Centre, which is where the East Midlands mayoral county is about to get underway, probably in about an hour or so's time. They've verified the polling cards. This is the first ever time that this part of the world has had a directly elected metro mayor anyway. Lots of talk of what's happening in the West Midlands and the Tees Valley. I think this one too in the East Midlands will give a really interesting indication of where the parties are at nationally. A lot of attention focused on this one. It is, I think, a straight two-horse race between Labour and the Conservatives. At the moment, it is Labour who are sounding much more confident than the Tories. The Conservatives I've been speaking to this morning pointing to a very difficult national picture. They believe they've got a strong candidate in the MP for Mansfield and leader of Nottinghamshire County Council, Ben Bradley, but he's feeling a little bit despondent at the moment. I have to say, Labour much more confident that their candidate, Claire Ward, a former Labour MP during the Blair and the Brown years, will be elected the first mayor of the East Midlands, covering Derbyshire and Nottinghamshire. So it doesn't necessarily cover the whole of the region as we know it. Leicestershire not included in it, but nevertheless a huge area, 2.2 million people, a large geographic one, stretching from the Peak District in the north to South Nottinghamshire down in the south. So yeah, lots of attention on this one nationally. We'll get the counting underway, as I say, in about half an hour's time. The result due between 1 and 2 o'clock.
Peter, just give us an indication of the kind of role, the kind of powers that this political post has.
Yeah, I mean, different metro mayors in different parts of the country have got different ranging powers, really. So if you look at Sadiq Khan in London, I mean, he's responsible for quite a lot down there. Less so here in the East Midlands. The main kinds of areas that they'll be responsible for are things like public transport, housing provision, skills and training, so further education. Ultimately, they'll be responsible for hundreds of millions of pounds, though, of central government funding, and we're going to get more and more metro mayors, aren't we, today in other parts of the country, electing them for the very first time too. I'm detecting a fair amount of scepticism, I have to say, talking to voters in this part of the world about the idea of having another elected politician. That may well be borne out in a low turnout when we get it eventually. But yeah, I think once people understand what a mayor does, and we've seen that in other parts of the country, Greater Manchester, the West Midlands, then those those politicians tend to be very, very well known. They tend to do perform quite well, and that's why, in many respects, this is a different contest to what is happening in the West Midlands and the Tees Valley, where you've got two Conservative incumbents there that have quite successfully managed to create a sense of them being apolitical, really, standing up for the region and not really having to be going along with what the party is doing nationally. That is not necessarily the case here, so I don't think the Conservative candidate will be able to do that in quite the same way here. They don't have that track record to already speak of. So the expectation here is that Labour are in a very, very strong position. And bear in mind that this area contains an awful lot of really important parliamentary constituencies that will decide who ultimately wins the general election. So if you focus on areas like Rushcliffe, Mansfield, Amber Valley, these are traditional bellwether seats anyway. So, yeah, a very, very, very interesting contest here.
Peter, thank you. Let's head to the Tees Valley mayoral race now. We can speak to Richard Moss, political editor, North East and Cumbria. Hi there, Richard. What's happening?
Well, we're getting ever closer to result here. Counting has been going on since 9:30. Actually, we've had 3 of the 5 councils that make up the Tees Valley Combined Authority area have declared. And it's good news for the incumbent Conservative Lord Houchin, Ben Houchin. He came out on top in all 3 of those councils. Now, one of them, Hartlepool, Labour had a very good night in the council elections there last night, winning 8 seats. The Conservatives have lost 6 seats, but he came out on top amongst Hartlepool voters in terms of the Tees Valley mayoral. So that's a very strong indication that he is going to win here. Now, it's nowhere near the 73% that he won in 2021. It's not that sort of triumph. But he was saying before this happened, he'd be glad to win by 1 vote. He's won, I think, it looks like by clearly more than that. We've still got 2 more council areas to declare, so obviously they could change the picture. But he's built up a significant lead already. Now, who'll be most relieved about that? I don't know, Ben Houchin or Rishi Sunak. There were going to be serious questions within the Conservative Parliamentary Party if he lost mayoral contests like this one as to whether Rishi Sunak could deliver any sort of good result in a general election. This is a key area, an area where Boris Johnson did extremely well in 2019, won again the Hartlepool parliamentary by-election in 2021. Keir Starmer considered resigning after that. Things were looking so bad. So Labour have turned things around from there. They've got a lot closer to Ben Houchin this time. But it is, they would say a very personal vote for Ben Houchin and not really anything that can be of much solace to Rishi Sunak or the Conservative MPs who want to hold on to their seats in this part of the world come a general election.
Richard Moss, thank you for that. I know you'll keep us up to date. We're going to head to Cannock Chase now. Council, our correspondent there, Joanne Riddle, is on the ground. Hi, Joanne. Good to see you. What's the story there?
Well, we're at Cannock Leisure Centre. Counting is getting underway here. The reason the focus of attention is on here is because the council has historically been a Labour stronghold, but in more recent years it's changed hands a number of times. So back in 2021, the Conservatives took control of Cannock Chase Council for the very first time, and then last year Labour gained some ground, but they didn't gain enough seats to take overall control. In fact, there was no overall control last year, with Labour and the Conservatives having an exactly equal number of seats. So for the last year, the council here has been run by a Labour and Green alliance. Cannock is traditionally a former coal mining area. In fact, the Labour leader of the council, Tony Johnson, is a former miner himself. I did speak to him earlier. He said he's feeling cautiously optimistic, but of course it's far too early to tell. The same thoughts echoed by Olivia Lyons, the Tory group leader. She just said it's too early to tell too. This area back in 2016 was very pro-Brexit, with some 70% of the population here voting to come out of the EU. In most years here, the council just has a third of seats up for re-election. But this year, it's the whole council, all 36 seats, due to boundary commission changes. And in fact, there are fewer seats up for elections slightly compared to previous years because of those changes. So the result here is regarded as a potential for change, much greater as a measure of public opinion. But for now, here in Cannock, it's just a watch and wait.
Interesting. Thank you very much for that. That's the latest from Joanne there in Cannock Chase. We're going to get a broader picture now. We're going to speak to John McTernan, who is advisor to the Labour Party. Your assessment of the Labour performance?
Look, I think this shows Labour are back all across the country. I was particularly struck yesterday by the Police and Crime Commissioner vote in Cumbria. Normally, the Tories pick up Cumbria because the North votes Labour, the South votes Lib Dem, and the Tories get a vote all across the county. Labour holds no parliamentary seats in Cumbria, but Labour has got 5 targets there. It's now got a police and crime commissioner on a 22% swing. The Blackpool result speaks for itself, a 26% swing. We'd all be talking about Blackpool. It'd be the only thing we were talking about today because it's such a massive swing, 26%. We're not talking about it because it's only the 3rd biggest swing in a by-election for decades, and the 2 bigger ones were Labour against Rishi Sunak's government just recently. So there's something going on. Lincoln, a near wipeout for the Tories. Redditch, a massive win for Labour. Both those target seats. Labour, was it a 30% swing to Labour in the wards I was looking at? In Plymouth, another target. Picking up Thurrock in the southeast along the Thames. That council obviously was in trouble, but Labour wanted to pick it up and targeted it. You've got Labour, a picture of Labour being able to win the votes where it needs to win the votes, and what we're now seeing as the mayoral elections come in, I think a success for the mayoral model. People can vote for a figure that they like, whose actions they like, whose character they like, which they see. But it's really hard for Rishi to become an Andy Street figure or to become a Ben Hoochin figure.
But before we come on to the Prime Minister, what about the arguments that, turnout is pretty low, we haven't had many results, and governing parties usually take a bit of a kicking in circumstances like this, so it's best not to get overexcited?
Oh, look, I've read the Conservative Central Office line. You should expect these results in midterms. We are months away from a general election. These aren't midterms. These are end terms. And so what we're seeing is 20-point leads for Labour in the polls, and we're seeing the scale of that reflected in these votes. You can even out across the country, and I'm looking forward to all the Police and Crime Commission results coming out, because they may be low turnouts, but they're larger than the opinion polls. Opinion polls are based on 1,500 to 2,000 people, and they're very accurate. This is a massive poll across the country, and it gives you so much information about how Labour are doing and how badly the Tories are doing. For party management terms, I can understand the Conservatives will focus on this being local elections. But at the beginning of the year, remember, they were saying that the polls always tighten in an election year. And the polls have only tightened in the sense that Reform are getting closer and closer to the Tories in their projected vote.
So from all this, you're seeing nothing other than a huge Labour victory, a crushing Labour victory in the general election?
No, I see another thing, which is I think there's a huge expectation in the country that the polls will be translated into a Labour victory at a general election. And I think in a way we're seeing what the public will be looking like if there were a Labour government. And so what are the contours of that? First, Tories who distance themselves from the Tory brand and have good local profiles can win. So Andy Street, the election will be closer in the West Midlands. Ben Hoochin, the election is much closer than the polls nationally would say. You also see local factors in a place like Oldham. There's a huge independent vote in Oldham, which has, in the last 3 elections, it's taken the Labour leader in each election. So there's something big going on in Oldham.
Yeah, well, can I ask you specifically about? I wanted to get on to that. Clearly, Oldham is the story of the impact of the war in Gaza on the Labour vote and the damage it's doing to the Labour vote. How significant do you think that could be in a general election?
So I've not looked at the Oldham results in detail because I know that in Oldham there are local candidates who run as independents on conspiracy theory about child sex abuse. So there's something strange going on in Oldham. There has been for the last 3 years. But I want to say, it's part of my point about this is what Labour is going to look like. Labour will be the largest part of 2/3 of the voters in the country who are voting Lib Dem, Labour, Green. Those are progressive voters. Labour needs to do 2 things to defend itself on its left. It's doing really well to defend it, losing votes to the Tories or Reform. Got to stop losing votes to the Greens, who protest over the environment and also Gaza, and to independents. And what we've got to do is send the message again and again. Labour passed a vote in the Parliament for a ceasefire in Gaza and forced the government, the Tory government, to vote for a ceasefire at the United Nations Security Council. Labour's changed its position on Gaza. Our voters need to hear that loud and clear. It's clear they've not heard that, and the Gaza issue the independent there may cost us the West Midlands by-election, the 2 or 3% that goes to that independent there. And Labour needs to be clear. We're a social democratic party, a left of centre party. What we propose on the green transition, on climate crisis, is a big and a major programme. It's as large as Joe Biden's Inflation Reduction Act. That's not getting through to the voters who are voting green. People need to know that we're going green and we're going for peace in Gaza, and we have to be very strong in addressing that.
Okay.
It's not, our message hasn't got across yet.
Interesting. We'll see how those two issues play out when it comes to a general election. Great to have your thoughts, John McTernan. Thank you. We speak now to Taj Ali, co-editor of the Tribune magazine. I want to get your assessment of the results we've had so far, with the caveat we haven't had a lot of them yet.
Well, I think it looks like Labour is on course to win a landslide. They, of course, have been polling significantly higher than the Tories in the national polls, and they benefit from a deeply unpopular governing party. So anything other than strong results would be quite a shock for us. I think what I found most interesting actually was how Labour has performed in areas with a sizable Muslim community. And numerous results have told us that Labour is struggling with the Muslim vote. If you look at what's happened in Oldham, I was speaking to a member of one of the local mosques just last night who said turnout's going to be very low. People are abandoning the party, primarily because of what Keir Starmer had said in October, that Israel was justified in cutting off water and electricity to Palestinians. And that message was put on the leaflets. It was distributed across the country in various elections. And I think it's going to cost them in the West Midlands election, the West Midlands mayoral election, where you've got an independent candidate, Ahmed Yaqub, who's essentially said, don't vote for Labour because they are supportive of what Israel's doing in Gaza. And he probably won't poll more than 3%, but that might just be enough for the Tories to keep that position. And I think that's the danger for Labour, that the votes become split in numerous constituencies.
Can I just put to you what we heard just there from John McTernan on this issue? His line, his opinion was, the Labour Party did change position. It did X, Y and Z. It forced votes at the UN Security Council, forced amendments in the House of Commons. And it's simply that message hasn't got out. Do you stand by that?
Well, I think a lot of people feel it's too little, too late. There were numerous calls for Labour to adopt the position of calling for an immediate ceasefire. And we all saw what had happened in Parliament. It was actually the Scottish National Party who used their Opposition Day motion twice to call for a ceasefire. That first vote in November, where the vast majority of Labour MPs did not vote for a ceasefire, those names were recorded and there was a lot of anger. And so a lot of people find this disingenuous. They see this as trying to save face. And Labour's got a very long way to go to win back trust. This isn't just Muslim voters. There are many other councillors, non-Muslim councillors, who resigned from the party. I believe 98 Labour councillors had resigned over Gaza. But on the Muslim community, I have to say this is not just about Gaza. Muslims who are disproportionately working class, disproportionately in the Labour heartlands, have consistently voted for the party, and many have felt that they've been taken for granted. Labour's often approached Muslims and minority communities through the prism of so-called community leaders. This idea that individuals within the communities can give them a block vote. And when you get incredibly young people politicized by what's happening in Gaza, and we saw this with Iraq as well, Labour has to now try and win over a plurality of voters, voters who are going to ask tough questions, and that's going to be a serious headache for the party in the years to come.
OK, Taj Ali, thank you very much for coming on the programme, giving us a bit of the nuanced picture there over what is broadly a very good night for Labour. Conservatives, not so much. Our political correspondent, Nick Earley, can take us through that. Hi, Nick.
Hi, Lewis. Yeah, it's been a really tough night for the Tories, actually. And in Conservative Party HQ this morning, I'm sure they're trying to find some of the positives, those areas where they've managed to hold control of councils. Potentially, some of the mayor races might give them a bit of a silver lining. But on the whole, the picture is pretty bleak for the Tories. Let me show you this. First of all, this is the vote share compared to 2021 when these seats were last contested. Now, remember in 2021, Boris Johnson was leader. There was a bit of a bounce after the vaccine rollout. But look what's happened since. Look at the change in the last 3 years. That's the Tory vote change, down 14%. That is pretty big. It's also worth just looking through some councils where the Conservatives used to be in power but aren't anymore, in part because of this. Have a look here at Redditch, a bit of a bellwether seat. We've been saying that all morning. It's an area where the parties think that the result is pretty indicative of how the country's feeling. Look at that. The Conservatives have lost 11 seats, Labour won 10, and it means that this long line of blue down here is done. This is now a Labour-controlled council. Let's have a look at another one, Rushmore in Hampshire. Again, the Conservatives have lost 8 seats. Labour have won 7. A long line of blue has come to an end. It's now a Labour-controlled council. Finally, the electoral coalition that the Conservatives managed to build at the last general election in 2019 included Hartlepool. No, it didn't include Hartlepool. They won a by-election. Sorry, I'm slightly misleading you there. But Hartlepool was an area where the Conservatives have been doing all right in recent years, particularly after Brexit. It voted 70% leave in the Brexit referendum. Well, look what happened overnight. The Conservatives lost 6 seats. Labour won 8, and this went from a hung council to one that is now controlled by the Labour Party. Now, the big question a lot of people in Westminster are trying to work out is what this means for a general election. By-elections are different, but there was an important by-election overnight in Blackpool South, won, as we've been reflecting, by Labour. Look what happened to the Conservative vote. That is really bad. Down by almost a third. Most of that going to Labour, some of it going to Reform, the successor to Nigel Farage's Brexit Party. But if you're a Tory MP sitting this morning trying to figure out what this means for your election prospects, there is no graphic that's going to worry you more than that. 26% swing from the Conservatives to Labour. That is huge. That is the third biggest swing from the Tories to Labour since World War II. There have been a lot of by-elections recently where this sort of thing has happened. It's become a pattern that will really, really worry Conservative MPs.
OK, Nick, thank you very much. We can speak now live to Laura Trott MP, Chief Secretary to the Treasury and the Conservative MP for Sevenoaks. Thank you for coming on the programme.
Thank you for having me.
So this was a bad night for the Conservatives. How bad was it?
It's a really disappointing night, of course. Local elections are always tough for incumbent governments, but it's important to say also that this is, early on in the process. Results are coming in over the weekend too. And I think the real test will be when we have the mayoral results, because places like Tees Valley, Keir Starmer absolutely has to win if he's to get an overall majority at the next general election.
But there are plenty of commentators who are saying, yep, those mayoral elections are interesting, but actually Ben Houchen, Andy Street may well be winning despite being Conservative rather than because of being Conservative. It's their own personal profile in those areas.
Well, they'll be running on their fantastic track record, which they've done as Conservative candidates, and they've shown what Conservative candidates can achieve in their local areas. So fingers crossed for both of them. I know the results are coming for Ben very soon, and Andy will be over the weekend.
So the leaflets, they barely mentioned Conservative. They weren't even blue. This was about their personal track records and their personal polling, wasn't it? Not about the Conservative Party, which can't bode well ahead of a general election.
Well, that's not true. I mean, I've been up campaigning with them, and I think the thing that we saw on the doorstep is the fact that their track record is incredibly important. Of course, they're running on that. They've achieved a huge amount for their local areas, both of them. It's the opposite of what's happened in London with Sadiq Khan. So I think it's not surprising at all that they're running on their local achievements. OK, let's look at that Blackpool South result. Your reaction to it? I mean, obviously, this is a disappointing result. There were, as you'll know, very specific local circumstances for this by-election. And it's unsurprising given the circumstances in which the MP stood down. But a 26% swing, the third biggest swing since World War II. This is a record rejection of the Conservative Party to the Labour Party. Yeah, there was also a lot of people voting for reform in this by-election, and I think what we've seen here just shows that actually a vote for reform is a vote for Keir Starmer's Labour Party.
Well, let's talk about reform. They nearly beat the Conservatives. There's only 100-odd votes in it.
Yep, absolutely. And as I said, what this shows very, very clearly is that if you vote for reform, you are voting for Keir Starmer's Labour Party, a Labour Party who will not act to control illegal migration, who have no plan for our country and will take us backwards in terms of the economic progress that we're making.
Why do you think people are voting reform rather than voting Conservative?
As I said, this is a very specific circumstances in this by-election. You will know that, as I said previously, that the MP stood down in very difficult circumstances. As a result, I'm not surprised.
Away from that by-election, across the rest of the results, in pretty much every seat that Reform stood, they took votes from the Conservative Party. Why are people voting Reform rather than Conservative?
Well, as we discussed earlier, local elections are often very difficult for incumbent governments. People want to send incumbent governments a message, and we know it's been a really difficult year for people. Inflation has been very high, that's led to very high cost of living pressures. But what I would say to people at home is that the economy is starting to turn a corner. Inflation is down, real wages are up. We've got things coming in like the childcare offer, which is already being taken up by 200,000 families. We've got the Rwanda vote, which has just been passed, which means that planes can start taking up soon. So things are really starting to get brighter.
Is Rishi Sunak the right person for the general election? Because given these results, if they do pan out as they did overnight, and we've already given plenty of caveats, so we don't have a lot of results in at the moment, but if it is as bad as it looks right now, there doesn't seem to be any bright light that Rishi Sunak can do anything to change anything here.
He's absolutely the right person to be leading our country. And like I said, we've had a very difficult year because of cost of living pressures, because of the inflationary impact as a result of Putin's illegal war in Ukraine. But what the Prime Minister has done is he has made sure that the economy is turning a corner. He's brought inflation down, along with the Bank of England, from over 11% to 3.4% now. We've seen real wages rising as a result. Like I said, we've got things like the childcare offer, which is coming in now, which is a really positive thing for lots of families at home. We've got the state pension going up by 8.5% this year. You know, there's a lot of things, changes which are going to make a really big difference to everyone watching this programme.
And can you see a difference in results from tonight to whenever there is a general election? There just simply isn't enough time, is there?
Well, like I said, we're at very early stages with these results. Let's see what happens in Tees Valley. Let's see what happens with the other mayoral elections. I don't think we should be drawing too many conclusions too early. And the Tees Valley result will be one that Keir Starmer absolutely has to win if he's to win an overall general election. So let's see what happens there.
Laura Trott, thank you very much for coming on the programme. Thank you. So, with the caveat, lots of results still to come, but what can we read into the results that we do have? Well, Sir John Curtice is Professor of Politics at the University of Strathclyde. He gave us his take.
There are two principal messages that are coming out of these local election results together with the parliamentary by-election in Blackpool. The first is that so far as the gap between Conservative and Labour is concerned, nothing very much seems to have changed. In one sense, that sounds like a surprising statement because the swing from Conservative to Labour in Blackpool South at just over 26% is the third biggest swing in post-war electoral history. Trouble is, swings of that kind of size have now become rather commonplace in the last year or so. We've actually had 5 by-elections in which the swing from Conservative to Labour has been over 20%. So that in that sense, it's more of the same. It's a set of parliamentary by-elections of the kind that we have really not seen since the 92 to 97 Parliament, which of course ended in defeat for the Conservatives. Equally, if we look at the detailed voting figures that the BBC has been collecting overnight, and there's many of them more yet still to come. But so far, at least, it looks as though, if anything, support for the Conservatives in these local elections is a wee bit down on last year. Support for the Labour Party certainly holding firm, maybe very slightly higher. Anyway, either way, there's no evidence here of any closing of the gap that between Labour and the Conservatives, any narrowing of the Labour lead. So again, we've got more of the same, just indeed as the opinion polls have been suggesting. The one difference, but again it's anticipated by the opinion polls, is that Reform UK were performing more strongly than they did last year, though they still didn't fight that many of the wards. But crucially for the Conservatives, their intervention in Blackpool South almost created the embarrassment of getting the Conservatives ending up in third place. And in local council elections, places like Sunderland, for example, where again Reform did particularly well, you discover that it's the Conservative Party in particular that seems to suffer. And that again has been a message of opinion polls, but it's really a development of only the last 3, 4, 5 months ago. So it does basically mean the Conservatives are still in as much trouble as they were a year ago, with the added twist that they now have two parties biting into their vote, i.e. Labour and Reform, rather than just perhaps one for the most part 12 months ago.
Our thanks to Professor John Curtice for that. Right, one important footnote, because it's getting quite a lot of traction online. There was a headache for former Prime Minister Boris Johnson when he tried to vote. He was turned away. He was turned away from his local polling station because he didn't have the right photo ID. Why is that significant? Well, he was the Prime Minister who brought in the law that required the right photo ID. That was back in 2022. It was then compulsory for voters in England to show photo ID. What we understand happened then is that he left because he couldn't vote, went and collected his ID, and then came back and then was able to vote. Right, let's just mark your card for what is coming up, because plenty of votes. Let's go to Nottingham. Plenty of votes still being counted. So as you will have gathered over the last couple of hours, yes, it's a Friday morning and elections gone by would have all the results by now, or certainly most of them, and get a full picture. Not the case for the last, few elections, local elections, mayoral elections, results not coming in this morning, but coming in this afternoon and actually into the weekend. So we've got our live feeds ready. That's Nottingham. We've got Sunderland as well. We are waiting the results of local elections, as I mentioned, of course, but also mayoral elections too, hoping from a Conservative point of view, from their point of view, for some good news, a change in the narrative, which has been a pretty bleak one thus far. They're hoping to do well. We've also got our live feeds in Stockton, and let's bring you up to date with the very latest results when it comes to those number of councillors in England council results that we have so far. Labour up 59, Liberal Democrats up 20, Conservatives down 133, Independents up 39, and the Green Party up 15. That's just about it from me. Joe Coburn will be up next with Politics Live. Plenty more analysis to come, and plenty more results coming in as well. So do stay with us. For the moment, though, thank you very much for your time. Thanks for your company. I'm Lewis Vaughan-Jones. This is BBC News. Bye-bye.
It's Friday, it's 12 o'clock, and we're live in Westminster. A big victory for Labour in the Blackpool South by-election.
This was directly to Rishi Sunak to say we're fed up with your decline, your chaos and your division, and we want change.
Conservatives suffer big losses too in the local elections.
A disappointing night for us, but that's what you'd expect from parties in mid-term of government.
It's early days and counting continues. We're expecting a result in the race for Tees Valley Mayor in the next hour or so. Professor Sir John Curtice will be with us throughout, analysing all the electoral trends.
I'll be at the big screen crunching the numbers. There are lots of results still to come for mayors, police commissioners and councils.
I'll be talking to correspondents at counts up and down the country, politicians and commentators from across the political spectrum. With me throughout, the BBC's Deputy Political Editor Vicky Young, and at the start of today's show, Health Minister Andrea Leadsom, Labour's Deputy National Campaign Coordinator Ellie Reeves, and Liberal Democrat Deputy Leader Daisy Cooper. This is Politics Live. Yes, hello